Good morning. On behalf of the New York Public Library, we are delighted that you have chosen our newly transformed home for this conference. And by the way, I'm Risa Honig, and I am Vice President at the New York Public Library, and I work for Capital Planning and Construction. I hope you get a chance to explore this building, the Stavros Niarchos Library. It is the central circulating branch of the New York Public Library, and it offers knowledge, opportunity, and amenities for all New Yorkers across 7 floors of library space, all designed to make people feel welcome and inspired to learn and grow. Just as NYPL is proud and excited to provide New Yorkers with the libraries they need and deserve, all of us are excited about new, innovative opportunities in the realm of affordable housing, something needed by so many in our communities. One example I can personally speak to is how NYPL has partnered with the city, HPD, HDC, the Robin Hood Foundation, and others to provide a new library in the growing community of Inwood, along with affordable housing and several other much-needed amenities. And I believe a lot of our partners are here today, which is awesome. The project, once complete, will provide a hub of community activity and opportunity, all made possible with creative thinking in the area of affordable housing. These are the kinds of projects that truly make a difference in our city, and I am excited to hear from all the wonderful speakers and panelists here today. So welcome to our library. Please take a look around after the conference, get a library card if you don't already have one, and of course, take out a book. They're free. And when you have a moment, go to nypl.org and see the wide array of programs and services we offer. We'd love to see you in one of our locations soon. Thank you again, and enjoy this great day. And here's Ben.
Thank you so much, Risa, for hosting us here in this magnificent spot. I mean, to set the tone, public investment, right? We're seeing what we can do, right, when we do it right with design. Yeah, a little bit of thank you. I'm Ben Prosky, Executive Director of AIA New York and the Center for Architecture. We decided to take it uptown today, but I hope all of you know how to find us down on LaGuardia Place, where there are many great activities, exhibitions, programs going on. What is a crisis? When we looked at this, into this topic earlier this year, affordable housing, but crisis is really what stuck. So humor me for a little bit of, the dictionary thing. But it's always good to look, right? So Cambridge English Dictionary says, a time of great disagreement, confusion, and suffering, or an extremely difficult or dangerous point in a situation. And Merriam-Webster defines it as an unstable or critical time of state of affairs in which in which decisive change is impending. I like that last one. The crisis must have decisive change. So why an architecture organization, a not-for-profit, the Center for Architecture, why are we doing a day which is actually mostly about policy and economics? It's because, in a way, architects know everything about designing affordable housing and very little. And I'll say that with all due respect and affection, because as a group that represent architects, we often want to start by doing what we know best, which is designing our way out of a situation. But as someone who oversees, funds and resources there, I felt that I couldn't really, in many ways, host another charrette or competition where people were going to design great ways of people to live affordably if we didn't understand the policies and reasons why it's just so difficult to do it. So this is actually just the beginning of what is a discussion, a conversation. We want to see this out. So you won't see a lot of design today. You're going to learn, and then in the following year, maybe years, depending on how long we can resolve this, we're going to get to design. We're going to get to a lot of the really important things that we need to do. So this conference came about because a few people got together early this year and gave us a prompt and said, you know what, we got to do this fast. It is the beginning of a new mayoral administration in the city. Since the last mayor, who the numbers that he announced in the beginning kept mounting of our need for affordable housing. Right now, I actually haven't even seen the last number estimate. It was in the hundreds of thousands, and it's just not keeping up. And we have to get ahead of it. So this conversation was started. We got to do this. We got to organize it. An incredible group of people came together, and I just want to acknowledge this organizing committee. We started meeting early on over, maybe it was lunch, maybe this, and then it was like, we got to do this, and we got a schedule, and we started meeting. So incredible group, Barry Bergdahl, who is our Center for Architecture board chair, Carol Lowenson, architect at Mitchell Jurgala Architects, and also Center for Architecture board member, and also with the IDC Foundation, Brian Laughlin, who is an architect at Magnuson Architects and also our AIA New York housing co-chair, Kathleen McGuigan from Architectural Record, who's also on the Center for Architecture board, Hillary Sample, who teaches housing at Columbia University, also principal at Moss Architects, Ray Savino of the IDC Foundation, and Annie Tershwell of Type A Projects and Center for Architecture Board. So this is a group that came together, thought this up, and really committed to bringing the group together. It also couldn't have happened without incredible and generous support. So the IDC Foundation is not only the underwriter, but also a key developer in these ideas and commitment to how we're going to help New York deal with this crisis. And also academic partner, NYU School of Professional Studies, Shack Institute of Real Estate came in. Shack has committed to not only being a part of this conversation, but actually is going to be writing a report over the summer that we will have as a record of this day and of this moment so we can really build on it. So we're thrilled to have them. And Architectural Record has been a great media partner. So I'm going to leave it at that, except I cannot have done this without a staff. There's incredible staff at the Center for Architecture, especially Michael, who's running, here he is, fire by baptism, just started working with us earlier this year, now knows how to plan a conference like a pro, and all of the staff at the center who helped. So please give them a round of applause, and our founder, sponsors. So, and then you're going to hear from Michael Kimmelman. And Michael Kimmelman, as you know, is architecture critic from the Times, deeply committed to this issue. Michael also was one of the people who, he and I followed up on this a couple of times personally, a few calls. What are we doing about this? What are people doing about this? What are the architects doing about this? And so over that time, I know, and all of you know from reading, that Michael has observed a lot. And so we're thrilled to have Michael here to kind of kick us off with some key observations. Thank you, Michael.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I saw this when it was just, the construction was just finished, and I thought, what an incredible space. And of course, with COVID, I have not been here. I don't know about how many of you have come to events here, but isn't it wonderful to be in person and to remind ourselves why we build spaces like this. So it's for just this purpose. I wrote this yesterday and read through it this morning and realized I was completely unhinged when I was writing this. This is intended to just get you going. It's not intended to tell you anything you don't know. But I feel my role is to do something slightly provocative. So I'll just say I'm glad we gathered here because, like you, I'm extremely worried. I'm worried because I think of all the problems we face, and there are many. There really is no bigger or more urgent crisis with greater ripple effects in New York today than the affordable housing shortage. And I also worry about the state of our participatory democracy. I worry that we are losing the melody of our cosmopolis, forgetting what it takes to accomplish really big things together. It begins with diverse parties and public authorities having a robust, honest, constructive conversation, and I hope and assume that's what's going to happen today. So New York has historically, as many of you know, seized on crises and transformed them into opportunities. That's been our secret sauce, the source of our reputation as a great forward-thinking metropolis of modernity and hope. You know, we screw up, slum clearance, Hudson Yards, or we are screwed, 9/11, COVID, and somehow eventually we seem to stumble to a better place. It used to take months, right, for a restaurant to get a permit from the city for it to do outdoor dining, and removing even a single parking space from the city would trigger, like the Battle of the Somme from car owners. But the city, in effect, granted 10,000 permits and removed even more parking spaces like overnight when COVID suddenly threatened to bankrupt the restaurant industry. So we can do big things if we want. And streeteries, that's the name I didn't make up, but I kind of like them. Streeteries have transformed neighborhoods all across the city, rich and poor, reminding New Yorkers that our streets have not always looked the way they do, that they are not, in fact, the property of car owners, but are public spaces, and that they can be reimagined and remade with remarkable speed when we have the will and imagination. And that isn't only true about outdoor dining. In the 18th century, we poisoned the Collect Pond in Lower Manhattan, which was the main freshwater source for colonial and early American New Yorkers, leading to deadly outbreaks of cholera. And in response, we established what is today the city's largest bank to underwrite vast new sewer and water systems that allowed for the creation of Central Park, the New York Public Library across the street, and much else, which, as you know, was part of the system of the water system that was established to make up for our insane idea of putting tanneries next to our fresh water. And so New York, as we know it, sort of developed out of that crisis as well. And during the 20th century, with the collapse of the shipping business and the city's industrial waterfront, New York's lifeblood, right, since Henry Hudson first set his eyes on Manhattan, we diversified our economy, cleaned up our air and water, and reimagined our coastlines. The housing crisis, it seems to me, is a similar kind of slow, evolving disaster. When I moved back to New York from Europe a decade ago to start this job at the Times, affordable housing was at the top of my list of issues to address, because it clearly seemed to me the biggest problem facing the city. The first thing I wrote about was an affordable housing project in the South Bronx, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, called Via Verde. In highlighting that building, I wanted to make the point that architecture and design are part of, but also part of the solution to the city's housing crisis. I tried to weigh the building's economic premium on high-end architecture against the number of additional apartments that might hypothetically have been built with the same money. How do we value cost and how do we judge value versus cost, I should say? What is the value of dignity, pride, durability, equity in the things that we build? These are things architecture can bring to the affordable housing discussion. But architecture is not, as Ben said, where the conversation needs to begin, and it's not where we're starting today. Architects can challenge us to think in new ways and model a culture of collaboration, and they love, as has been said, cooking up fantasies of turning, New York's small, odd lots of public land into affordable housing projects, whether or not the economics pencil out. And renderings can be inspiring, but the reality is that millions of New Yorkers today are spending sometimes half or more of their incomes on rent, and some are hotbedding in Queens, where 11 people died during Hurricane Ida when their illegal basement apartments flooded. So before we talk about architecture and redesigning basements and so forth, we ought to do some very basic things. We can start by expanding our allowable accessory dwelling units and incentivize homeowners with basements and garages to renovate their properties. California, made ADUs legal, and in Los Angeles, I think ADUs now account for more than 20% of new housing. If California can do it, I think New York surely can do it. The last mayor promised to make the construction and preservation of subsidized housing a top priority, and he kept a running tab on the number of apartments that his administration could claim. It was like an auctioneer at Sotheby's, so the number kept going up. But in so doing, he often seemed to regard housing as if it were separable from all the things that comprise a neighborhood, which is to say the things that help make a house a home. Safe walkable streets, access to public transit, quality schools and jobs, libraries, healthcare, parks and plazas, food, culture. We need to think holistically when we talk about housing and about rezoning to allow for more housing. And we need to think upfront in terms of the needs of the communities and not just in terms of the number of units. And we really need to think bigger. We have a new mayor, and so a chance to re-energize the public conversation. It's hard not to look back and lament, right? All the ways we got ourselves into this mess, all the bad decisions, all the power imbalances, the subservience to luxury developers and the pathetic hope of eking out a few affordable apartments for public benefit, which, speaking of which, resulted in the failure not to have wrested more subsidized apartments out of Hudson Yards, for example. Going back further in time, we can lament the selling off of public land for a song during the 80s and 90s that we could now desperately use for large-scale affordable housing developments. I would argue we still have some room if we're creative. I've done the math, and I believe Manhattan has an average density of 640 residents per acre. Hope that sounds right. There's a public golf course in the Bronx. It's 198 acres. So you may have heard of it. So 640 times 198 equals 126,720 people who could be housed. I'm just saying. And along the same lines, for reasons that remain mysterious to me, we remain cowed by the owner of an aging sports arena that sits atop the Western Hemisphere's busiest and most miserable rail station, serving 600,000 working people a day in a neighborhood that does not need a dozen more humongous office towers no one will go to, but could sustain an abundance of mixed income housing in concert with a more robust, pedestrian-friendly public realm. Whose city is this? Our COVID streeteries aside, I think we have become, I don't know if you feel this too, increasingly cautious, defeatist, distracted, divided, sclerotic. NIMBYs often pose as preservationists a kind of Jane Jacobs people power, which arose in response to Moses's powers that be. I think too often default to a kind of rigid stance of anti-development. A decade has passed since Superstorm Sandy, which devastated low-income housing developments along the East River, and we have just begun the renovation of East River Park, a project that has riven that neighborhood along racial and class lines and barely begins to deal with the threat of rising seas in lower Manhattan. Climate change is not going to wait for us to get our act together. Many of you will recall how a few years ago activists in Upper Manhattan derailed a 15-story, 355-unit residence on the site of a derelict garage. The project involved a rezoning. The city's new mandatory inclusionary housing rules required that at least 20% of the units had to be below market rate for a rezoned development. By the way, that number should be much higher than 20%, and the affordability much deeper. But in any case, the developer in this case, as you may remember, volunteered to make half the units, I believe, 178 of them rent subsidized. And opponents still took to the streets, declaring the construction of any new market rate housing to be, quote, an existential threat to our homes and our community. So the project died. I understand fears about displacement and losing our neighborhoods, but cities are dynamic and collective organisms. They require sacrifice and involve change. My fear is that we've lost our ability to come together around progress, even to imagine that coming together is possible. We take to the barricades to protest nearly every new building proposal. I mean, this is not entirely new, but I think it's become, of course, but I think the tone has changed. And I think it's part of a wider, pessimism and despair that's a product of the divisions in our country. So having said that, look, promising things happen all the time, and I try to make my job partly writing about them to let people know that we can do better. HPD has been producing some really wonderful affordable housing projects. I'm sure we'll hear about them. I wrote about one the other day, a new deeply subsidized senior development in the South Bronx. I also wrote about the renovations at Baychester, a RAD project by NYC, again in the Bronx, which turned a really decrepit collection of leaky, crumbly buildings into a leafy campus of playgrounds and refurbished apartments. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go look. Glassed-in entrances replaced, the old carceral doorways. There are new lobbies, new light fixtures in the hallways, new recycling rooms and compactors, new bathroom fixtures, windows, kitchen appliances. Look, it's mostly cosmetic. It's not architecture with a capital A, and we'll have to keep an eye on how the place is managed and maintained. But I gather NYCHA was spending about $14,000 a year per unit pouring cash into these deteriorating apartments. The new managers are spending $9,000 per apartment, and their costs are lower because the buildings have been upgraded to meet current energy standards and they require less maintenance. And I've talked to a bunch of tenants and they're super happy. They were frightened and skeptical beforehand, and who could blame them, right? They feared displacement. NYCHA is a trail of broken promises, false hopes, and abandonment. RAD seemed like another ruse, which threatened privatization, since NYCHA, by implicitly acknowledging that it was no longer capable of maintaining its properties, was handing over maintenance and renovations to private interests. And on social media and by word of mouth, misinformation about RAD spread like wildfire, and NYCHA, not surprisingly, struggled to counter that narrative. As I understand it, NYCHA still owns and oversees RAD properties. Tenants can't be displaced, unless they fail to pay the rent. Private managers can be replaced if they don't do a good job, and no apartment can be converted to market rate when a tenant moves out. Is RAD ideal? No. Not all developers are good actors. If NYCHA hasn't been a very good player at overseeing its properties, will it be good at overseeing private developers? I don't know. Should the richest nation on earth build, fund, and run a great public housing system? Yes. And America should also establish a universal right to housing. But in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of NYCHA tenants continue to wait for improvements. Residents at Edenwald, the NYCHA development across the street from Baychester, after they saw what Baychester got, asked for more of the same. Seeing is believing, the president of Edenwald said to me. And that's the bottom line. We need to get thousands of underserved people affordably, humanely, securely housed. I've been spending time in Houston, which, as you know, is the nation's fourth largest and it claims most diverse city, which a decade ago had one of the worst homeless problems in the country. I want to end with this just little anecdote because I want to tell you, since then, so since 2012, really 2011, 2012, Houston has cut its homeless count by 63%. A homeless veteran in Houston in 2012 waited 720 days and had to navigate 76 bureaucratic steps to get from the street into permanent supportive housing. Today, the wait for housing is 32 days. How has Houston accomplished this? And I have to say to the crowd here, no, the lack of zoning is not the answer. And it really isn't. And officials there will tell you, rightly or wrongly, but whatever, they'll tell you that the lack of zoning is, if anything, a problem, not an explanation, because it doesn't allow officials there to enforce, as they would have with mandatory inclusionary zoning, some kind of affordability. And they've got plenty of NIMBYs and covenants and other obstructions. As best I can tell, they've done it by coming together. City and county officials, service providers, landlords, downtown business leaders, organizations, politicians, nonprofits who ordinarily bicker and compete have come to the conclusion that they share an interest in fixing the problem, which has trumped their differences. Not everybody is on board, but key players are, including the mayor. The system is still precarious and progress is halting and incremental, and Houston is coming up against some of the same affordable housing problems, shortages that New York faces. But I think the city's success shows us what can happen when business, nonprofit, civic, and community leaders seek common ground around a problem like housing. Surely, New York can do the same or better. So, I turn the stage over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for these really great observations and for setting a tone for today. I'd like to welcome up our panel moderator, Hilary Sample of Columbia University, for our first panel and the speakers. Just a note, there is simulcast, so people are tuning in. Hello to all of you who are not with us. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being here. Hilary.
Great. Good morning. It's wonderful to see all of you here this morning, and very exciting to think that you were willing to get up so early on a Friday morning to come talk and learn and listen and participate in the conversation on housing. Michael is a wonderful keynote. And I have had just an incredible privilege and luxury to be part of this organizing committee where we've been talking for the last 4 months. So I'm going to miss those conversations, but I think we'll continue in a different format. So for this morning, I'll just jump into the introductions. We have 3 wonderful speakers. I'm going to introduce each of them and then call the first speaker to the podium. So this morning, we're going to hear from Nicholas Dagenblum, is a professor and director of the Master in Urban Planning program at Hunter College. His research analyzes long-term planning outcomes in essential urban systems, such as subsidized housing and mass transportation. He is co-editor of 4 collections, including the prize-winning Public Housing Myths by Cornell in 2015, and Affordable Housing in New York, published in Princeton 2015. He is the author of The Great American Transit Disaster, Austerity, Autocentric Planning, and White Flight from the University of Chicago Press, Historical Studies of North American series, forthcoming in March 2023. The second speaker will be Moses Gates, who is Regional Plan Associate Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Planning, leading the organization's planning, research, and advocacy efforts in affordable housing, economic development, and urban design. Since joining RPA in 2016, Moses has led the RPA's recommendations on affordability, economic development, and livable neighborhoods for the 4th Regional Plan, and authored or overseen several reports on housing policy and neighborhood planning. Moses also has worked for New York City's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development as a nonprofit affordable housing developer. He is currently a visiting assistant professor at the Pratt Institute and serves on the board of directors for Neighborhood Housing Services of New York City. Our last speaker will be Irene Gould-Ellen. The Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning is a faculty director at the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. She has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters related to housing policy, community development, and school and neighborhood segregation. Professor Ellen has held visiting positions at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Urban Institute, and the Brookings Institution. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Dagenblum.
Morning. I'm honored to be here. And I'm going to queue up the slides. Let me see here. Do we have slides? Could someone help me? You're working on it? Okay. I'm living that's me. All right. There I am again. Nope, not me. I have it on a drive. Well, I'll start talking while we queue up. So I've been asked to do a history of affordable housing in 10 minutes with focusing on New York. Oh, there it is. Okay, cool. And so I'll keep it short. I have 10 minutes. So we'll talk about 3 major crises that New York City has faced and also the nation in terms of housing. And I think the takeaway lesson to build on Michael Kimmelman's talk is, there's enormous expectations about what each of these sort of eras of affordable housing could achieve, and then there's also a reality that the engagement developing certain kinds of affordable housing also has consequences, and so we'll be looking at that today. So we begin with the promise of public housing. So although it's forgotten, and Michael's bringing up the renovation of public housing today, but it's important to realize that public housing begins as a very idealistic movement in the 1930s to build very high quality housing for the working class. And the crisis it was addressing was a long-standing crisis of substandard tenements, but also it was about addressing mass unemployment. So it had 2 major foci in this period. Let me just go back for a second. I'm not sure. Okay. I just point out that the quality of the early projects was very high, and there's every reason to be optimistic in the 1930s. Unfortunately, the way federal policy was organized, public housing was, particularly because of the Housing Act of 1937, was oriented around very low-income tenants. It basically did not have a neighborhood planning focus. They were highly segregated. It was this no-frills. You know the story about public housing a little bit. And the reality was that in the subsequent decades, public housing began to be seen as a crisis in itself. Certainly from the 1960s forward, a kind of public management issues, which Michael highlighted, poverty concentration, crime, and reputational decline. And particularly in New York, we have a kind of solution, right, to this crisis of both public housing and also other sort of larger trends in the city that were going on. So we have the first emergence of what I would consider to be a robust public-private partnership, particularly in New York State. And as goals, now, instead of public housing being kind of the solution to a lot of these issues, this public-private partnership was oriented around solving some of the problems that had emerged in public housing in terms of the concentration of poverty, design issues, and management issues. Also, it was designed, this public-private partnership was also designed to help kind of reinvest in cities in New York State. And I'll focus on the Mitchell-Lama program from the 1955, but really became a large program in the 1960s. But it really was about kind of like rooting the middle class back in the city through these what became very large-scale projects like Co-op City and so forth. And they did often piggyback on or were associated with the large-scale Title I public-private partnership of redevelopment. In this period, too, there was still a great concern about substandard housing in the city. And what we see in New York in particular, I mean, just a tremendous investment, particularly of the state leveraging private sector investment in Mitchell-Lama projects. And many of you are probably familiar with this, but you had a lot of basically private interests building Mitchell-Lama housing. You had nonprofits. You had just a massively productive system of housing in the hundreds of thousands of units. And you're going to get a sense, these are the sort of classic tower in the park, much like public housing, but with a middle class focus, large scale production, a lot of kind of emphasis on rethinking neighborhood life in this. And there was a lot of program innovation in Mitchell-Lama. In the 1960s, there were efforts to integrate, and actually fairly successfully, these middle-income projects, both in terms of race and social class. There were, in the late period of Mitchell-Lama, under what's we known as the UDC, Urban Development Corporation, there was a lot of architectural innovation. There are a lot of very positive things about Mitchell-Lama. But unfortunately, for those in the know as well in this, Mitchell-Lama was not without its own crisis in the 1970s, and the kind of inflation we're facing today and those issues were even more intense in the 1970s. And there were a lot of issues, and I've kind of listed them up there, where Mitchell-Lama and the other public-private partnerships in other states from this period encountered problems, whether it was in construction issues, maintenance, rising operating costs, rent strikes. Co-op City is the most famous example of major problems related to these large-scale developments. And in fact, it was so bad that one of the factors, the leveraging that had gone on in terms of bond sales and so forth, was one of the factors that contributed to the near collapse of New York State and so forth. So it was a major problem. So that brings us to the third and sort of the revamped private-public partnerships that we are in today, right, from the 1970s forward, and with a new set of goals. And, Michael mentioned that, there's only so much that affordable housing can do, and that's partly because one of the goals was to deleverage the government's direct involvement financially, managerially, in affordable or subsidized housing. There were also ongoing issues still with public housing, both in New York but nationally too, that the new public-private partnerships would address through programs like Hope 6, now today PACT. They also were designed to basically address the massive disinvestment and abandonment in American cities. And tagged on were growing concerns, not as sort of big today, but about homelessness and rent-burdened tenants. So quite a list, right, I think we can see. And down below, you'll see that the big programs, and I'm sure you're all familiar with these, are LIHTC, Section 8. These are kind of the classic post-1970s ways of reinvesting in affordable housing while maintaining basically the government's sort of distance from it. Public housing was very productive in terms of units. Mitchell-Lama, at least in New York State, was very productive, but there were major risks for the government. So it's about deleveraging risk, and programs like LIHTC and Section 8 have done that, at least so far. We'll see. I have one more slide, another slide. There we go. And I'll just mention that again. We see nationally are people like James Rouse with the Enterprise Foundation, basically developing systems for using these tax breaks and so forth and packaging them up and reselling them in affordable housing developments. We see mayoral plans, and then we see the growing interest of various state or other housing finance agencies in this activity. And of course, there's a lot to like in what's been done. Michael Kilman many years ago did a piece, featuring what was going on in Melrose in the Bronx. He also mentioned Villa Verde. And I think that the affordable housing movement has had real accomplishments, and actually quantitatively in terms of production, in terms of stabilizing neighborhoods in cities like New York in particular, and also rebuilding the image, really making a much more positive image after the era of both public housing and, to a limited extent as well, Mitchell-Lama. What we see now, though, is that the original goals, right, for affordable housing are all still there, right? That the affordable housing still has, is leveraging without enormous government risk. It's still dealing with sort of the leftover issues around public housing. It's supposed to reverse disinvestment, reduce homelessness, and so forth. But also we expect affordable housing now to also prevent gentrification, reduce overcrowding, and I know Moses Gates will be talking about this, also achieve regional equity, right? So we've added, it's quite a list of what we expect from the affordable housing sector. And, I guess, and maybe in this conversation we can have about this, it's interesting to talk about what's realistic under current policies and funding level. Do we, for instance, expect too much of this sector without also thinking about what are some of the consequences, right, of the way we build today? Because there are, just as there were consequences to sort of the public housing era and the Mitchell-Lama era, there are consequences to how we develop affordable housing today. And one of those, for instance, is concern about who is basically going to be housed in affordable housing developments. So I think that's my 10 minutes. So I think all right. Should I sit or?
So good morning. I'm Ingrid Ellen, and I think my slides should be coming up, although I'm a little intimidating showing slides in this very design-focused room. So maybe it's just better I just talk from the numbers. But I'm going to go back. Let me just say I'm going to go back in time too, following Nick. I'm not going to go back quite as far as Nick, but I'm going to go back to about 1970, go back about 50 years, and answer what is a seemingly simple question of how much, has housing become less affordable in New York City over this 50-year period, or really more, it's more accurately sort of how much less affordable has housing become over this 50-year period, and to answer that question, of course, we need to define affordability, right? And it turns out that that's actually not that simple. There are many ways to measure affordability. And first, there's sort of the distinction between home buying and renting, oops, I'm cutting to the punchline. This chart shows our Furman Center index of housing price appreciation back to 1974. And it shows that house prices are nearly 20 times higher today than they were in 1974. Like, yikes. I don't know what else to say, right? And importantly, that's not because actually homes have gotten larger or homes have gotten nicer and more luxurious. They have, but actually our index controls for that, right? So the idea is that it captures basically the increase in prices of the very same homes that sell in multiple times. And to be sure, this index does not control for inflation, and incomes have gone up during this time as well. But if I graph, the blue line is the trend in median income during this period, and you can see, yes, median income has risen too during this period, but it's gone up about 6.5 times as compared to nearly 20 times for housing prices. So, to get a sense of sort of how high housing prices are relative to incomes, the sort of one benchmark in the industry is that the median house price should be about no more than sort of 2.6 times the median incomes. In New York, it's about 10 times as high Okay, so we're like way out of whack. Okay, and unfortunately, when home buying becomes really expensive, where do frustrated home buyers go? They rent. They go to the rental market and they put upward pressure on rents, and that's exactly what we've seen. So this graph shows the basically the blue line is median income, median household income of renters, and the black line is rents back to 1970. And this one controls for inflation, actually. And you can see, actually, during this time period, that median incomes have really stagnated, right? And they're actually somewhat lower in real terms after controlling for inflation than they were in 1970. But meanwhile, rents have risen after controlling for inflation by 75%, okay? And this is cruel math, right? And what has the result been, right? If rents are going up faster than income, it means people have to spend more of their incomes on rent. And that's exactly what we've seen. And one, probably the most standard metric of, and Michael mentioned this, of sort of affordability is the share of renters that have to pay more than 30% of their income on rent, which is generally defined as sort of as a rent burden. And so if you look over the decades, what can you see? Well, you've seen this sort of march upward of the share of households that are sort of officially rent burdened or paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Today, it's about half of renters in New York, and this is pre-COVID. Half of renters in New York, so I should say today, it's right in 2020, are paying paid more than half of their income on rent, and that was up from less than 30% in 1970. And so, what's going on here? I mean, and let me say one other thing is that on the one hand, yes, rents fell and gave, sort of in the immediate wake of COVID, we did see a decline in rents in New York that sort of gave renters a little bit of a breather, and some people got some good deals. But rents have basically rebounded to the point where they're right back on the trend that they were on before. And so, what's going on? I mean, and this should be like, why are we paying so much more of our income on housing? I mean, it's really been a sea change of, and sort of a generational change. And I think that there's no easy answer to this question. And it's like, I study housing. I should be able to tell you in 30 seconds what the answer is. Some people, and I'd say there's sort of three categories of answers, right? The first answer is just, we're not building enough, right? Due to some combination of regulatory barriers, sort of, zoning, other regulatory barriers, declining availability of land, the failure of federal rent subsidies to keep up, that we're just not building enough to keep up with the demand. And importantly here, and Moses will talk more about this, this is really a regional problem. And I just want to say one thing, which is that just sort of one stat between 2010 and 2018, Nassau, Suffolk, and Westchester, I think, issued fewer building permits per capita than any suburb in Northern California, than any suburb in Southern California, than any suburb in Connecticut, than any suburb in Massachusetts, than any suburb in New Jersey. I mean, I could go on. And so, the suburbs in New York really are need to step up. The second piece, the second sort of explanation is that, let's see if that one's clicking. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be pointing this. Oh, there, now I might have gone too far. Okay. Hold on. Okay, you got it. Okay, so can you go back one? I'm sorry. Okay, the second explanation is that basically higher income households are bidding up rents for the rest of us, right? For the typical New Yorkers, they're squeezing the budgets of typical households, and that's partially just sort of macro structural. We've seen this real change over this time period in the income distribution in the United States, where it's sort of that we're seeing this loss of middle income, middle skill jobs, and we're seeing a real, the high end of the income distribution is really pulling away from the median, And so what does that mean? It means that sort of those high-end earnings are willing to pay a lot more for housing and squeezing the budget of the typical households. They're also demanding more space as well, and which I think Moses may also talk about. The other thing I'll say, this has been particularly pronounced, I think, in New York, in cities like New York that have attracted a large number of college graduates and higher income households in the last few decades. The labor market for college graduates in New York has been really strong and robust, where the labor market for workers without college degrees has really been weak and stagnating. And so, we've seen, and there's potentially sort of a growing interest in urban amenities as well, and so this has been kind of particularly pronounced in large cities like New York. The third category of explanations is a little bit more speculative, but some argue that there is less competition in the housing sector today than there was before, and this, I think there's anecdotal evidence of growing involvement of financial entities and investors in buying up homes. There's some evidence of growing concentration in the home building industry, and there is also evidence of increased foreign investment as well, especially in cities like New York. So, I think this is just sort of some context to say that on the one hand, we're in a particular moment today, this post-pandemic, let's say post, here I am wearing my mask, ending pandemic moment. But this affordability crisis has really been mounting for decades. So it's sort of this, we're seeing this sort of COVID hit on top of this real structural problem in rising unaffordability in New York, and I think the underlying causes are a little bit less clear. I mean, it's really a combination of causes, but ultimately it's some combination of the fact that we've sort of got rising demand at sort of the high end of the market, and supply just isn't keeping up. So I hope we'll have some time today, on the panel to talk briefly about some solutions. I hate to sort of leave it here, but I'm going to leave it here and hand it over to Moses. So thank you.
I will try to be a little quick so that we can leave, some room for discussion. I was teed up earlier. I was the first false one. Can we get that one back? Well, I'm going to start. We've kind of arranged this in chronological order in a weird way. I'm going to start in 1980. And starting in 1980, really, because that's kind of the start of our macroeconomic cycle and our macro housing cycle here in New York, where you really start where the population housing decline of the 1970s had kind of come to an end, and it was really the late 70s where you started to see growth again since then. And if you look at just a straight how much the population has grown in New York and how much housing units have grown in New York, it looks like there's not much of a story. Population growth has slightly outpaced housing unit growth, and that's mostly explained by a very slight increase in the number of people per household during the same time. So if you just look at that, it's like, okay, we build more houses, we get more people, city grows. What's the issue? Wait, what did I do? There we go. But so the important thing is to look at what parts of our housing profile have changed. One big one is the decline of rent regulation, rent control, rent stabilization since 1980, where you can see our regulated units are down and almost all of the growth essentially has come in unregulated housing units since 1980. The other one is that our vacancies have skyrocketed. And, I want to stress that the vacancy conversation in New York and how it affects our housing market is a big deal. It is not a small deal. In other cities, it can be a little bit of a small deal. In New York, you can see our vacant and available units since 1981 have more or less stayed steady. They've increased, somewhat of an amount to kind of to go along with the growth of our housing stock. But our vacant and unavailable units, and specifically our pied-à-terres, which are essentially seasonal, occasional, and recreational use, have increased substantially. So you have that parallel housing and population unit growth, but many, many more of the units are becoming vacant. These vacant and unavailable units are not counted in official vacancy statistics for, for New York City, which is why you don't have a about 11% vacancy rate in Manhattan, for instance, in the official numbers. The other part of it is that there are more people not in housing units. This is the other story between 1980 and 2020. Our non-institutionalized group quarters population has also skyrocketed. Institutionalized group quarters population are generally incarcerated people, mental health facilities, and nursing homes. Non-institutionalized are dorms and emergency shelters. And about 1/3 of that growth is dorms, and about 2/3 of the growth is emergency shelters in New York City, where we have about 60 to 70,000 more people in group quarter emergency shelters in 2020 than we did in 1980. So the population has increased, the housing units have increased, but a lot of the population is not in housing units, and a lot of people are, and a lot of the housing units don't have people. And, this is, I heavily fall on Ingrid's second explanation, some first, a lot of second for our housing crisis, which is, this is essentially a product of our growing economic inequality since 1980, where you have, oh no, I didn't do that one, I promise. Where you have, all right, where you have an increase in high earners, not just bidding up existing housing prices, but high earners want more space. They want more space in the form of second homes. They want more space in the form of larger homes. And in a weird way, they want more space in the form of smaller families per home. Wealthier households have smaller household sizes than less wealthy households. And so how we use space in New York and in the region is a big part of our housing crisis. And one of the things I would love to do is try, as an urban planner, is try to dig through the old Pluto data and see actually how much residential square footage per person has changed. You couldn't go back to 1980, but you could probably go back to 2000 until now. I don't think you could break it up by income band, but I think it's fairly obvious that most of that additional use of space is by the wealthier cohort. Wait, can I go to the next slide? All right. So I am from the Regional Plan Association. We have a 31 county region. Think of it as everywhere the commuter rail goes, plus the Croton watershed, because we made sure to keep our watershed in our regional planning overview. And so when we talk about New York City's housing market, we're really talking about a regional market. If you're searching for a home in Douglaston, you're probably also looking in Great Neck. If you're searching for a home in Mount Vernon, you might be looking in Eastchester. This is one regional housing market, and for anybody who's walked across the border from Queens to Nassau or the Bronx to Westchester, you can't really tell you're in a different place. It all kind of blends together. And so the regional component is a big deal, and I really want to show why. But the thing I will say is, first of all, not all suburbs are created equal. The New York suburbs are bad. I will say that. I don't care if I am quoted on it, and especially the inner New York suburbs. The Connecticut suburbs are not much better, but the New Jersey suburbs are actually outpacing New York City in terms of housing growth. mostly because New Jersey has a statewide framework that requires a certain amount of housing growth from each municipality, and it's much more difficult for everybody, for each municipality to institute exclusionary zoning when they have those housing targets that they have to have. Like Ingrid had mentioned, the three worst performing counties are Nassau, number 1, Suffolk, number 2, I think Westchester is number 3, and then Rockland is number 5, with Litchfield County in Connecticut being number 4. And Litchfield County, you know, also probably underperforming due to not as much market demand as in Suffolk, Nassau, Westchester, and Rockland. And so I'm going to see if I can remember my memorized statistics from here. The big statistic is Long Island, Nassau, and Suffolk have produced about 7 building permits from 2010 to 2020 per 1,000 residents. Hudson County in New Jersey has produced 65. So there really is a discrepancy. And to some extent, this is the story of our region. Our job growth has become increasingly concentrated in New York City, in the core, in Manhattan. Our housing growth has become increasingly concentrated in northern New Jersey, and we have one crumbling 110-year-old rail tunnel connecting the two of these places as kind of our regional transit, not counting path or vehicular tunnels. So this is why, and I'm obliged to say this as a member of Regional Plan Association, we must build the Gateway Tunnel sooner rather than later, and I will avoid getting into Penn Station. But this is really a story of 2010 to 2020. The suburbs from 1980 to 2000 and even a little into the 2000s were not always this bad. It's post-recession that it's really dropped off a cliff. And the story from 1980 to 2010 is a little bit different if you look at Westchester, Nassau, Rockland, and Suffolk. There, and this is really interesting, at least from my nerdy perspective, housing unit growth was about the same as New York City, about 25%. Population growth was much less. Population growth was only 14%. So in the inner suburbs, housing unit growth outpaced population growth. And you might say, well, that's terrific. There should be a lot of vacancies. Housing should be cheap. But that is not what happened. And there's really 3 reasons why it didn't happen. Number 1, just like in New York City, second home ownership skyrocketed in the inner suburbs. It went from about 20,000 to about 100,000 vacant and unavailable units in the inner suburbs. The second one is that there were no group quarter population increases like there was in New York. Group quarters population actually went down about 5,000 people in the inner suburbs. So you have way more units being built with nobody in them, and also not a lot of population growth that isn't in housing units. And those 2 things kind of explain that discrepancy. The third one is the household size in the inner suburbs has really shrunk. It went from about 3.1 people per household to 2.9 people per household, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is significant in demographic terms. So what you have is many less people per house in the inner suburbs, mostly because the population is aging. The population over 65 went from about 10% to about 16%. So you have houses with less people in them. And one of our big policy solutions at Regional Plan Association is an as-of-right accessory dwelling unit or subdivision law, which would essentially add a kitchen to an apartment and to a house and allow that house to house the same amount of people as it housed in the 60s, 70s, 80s when it was a family household. And really kind of returning the intent of that kind of housing to how it's used. So that is my presentation, and I think I'm supposed to invite my other 2 panelists up here to come talk about the history of housing in New York.
easier to hear me. Okay, thank you all for your presentations. I think just following a little bit, and I wanted to get maybe Ingrid, if you could, you had mentioned there were some positive examples. I think part of what we talked about in this preparation was to obviously acknowledge the crisis and that we have in housing that has been ongoing. I think to also try to drill down a little bit into the magnitude of it, and understand maybe a little more specificity around that, but then to also offer up examples of maybe some positive trends, if there are any, or examples as a kind of counterpoint, so that we have some other benchmarks also to look towards.
Sure.
Maybe, I don't know if it's okay to put you on the spot
Sure,
to,
no, that's
to
fine.
start.
That's fine. Can you hear me? Is that working? Okay, good.
Not really, someone said.
No, oh, really? Okay. Whoops. Okay. Does that work better?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, I think I would maybe suggest 3, just because 3 is a good number. And the first that I'll say is something that is really outside of New York, though. And Michael mentioned this. I mean, you know, Moses mentioned this to some degree. Is that we've actually seen quite a bit of innovation in states outside of New York State, in terms of states actually preempting local exclusionary zoning, and things like in California making ADUs as of right statewide. But California is not the only state that's doing this. You've seen a lot of action in Oregon, you've seen Maine. So you're seeing states around the country that are beginning to actually, you know, to really push localities and force them to actually allow some building in their communities. So I think that's positive. Less positive is the fact that New York State is not there yet, but they're positive. There are some proposals out there, and I commend RPA for sort of really pushing on the ADUs. Let's hope that maybe that will come back around. But so that's number 1. Number 2 is that I think I would mention, I mean, again, as Michael mentioned, I mean, RAD is not perfect, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, but it's the only game that we've got for public housing, and I think you've seen some really fantastic RAD conversions, both in New York City and also around the country, and that really promise to improve the conditions in public housing, while also ensuring that tenants can remain and actually retain exactly the same rights that they have today, and so that public housing can remain the incredible resource, and Nick certainly knows this, right, for affordable housing in New York City that it provides. And so I think that's number 2. You know, I think that number 3, I think I would mention, I mean, I think there are some interesting innovations. I mean, I'd mentioned sort of I was also going to say sort of the library program that was mentioned, that I think there are some interesting ways, some interesting programs like that have creatively kind of found land in New York and built up at the same time. What's lovely about that one is that you're maintaining a community institution, and you're maintaining social infrastructure and building that into affordable housing. So I really love that program as well.
Yeah, I think that's really remarkable. I mean, just to maybe, if we could drill down a little bit more into the numbers, because they're large, and they're in some ways they're abstract, and how do we start to understand them on the kind of human, personal, people level, right? When we think about lack of affordable housing, lack of rental units, and who are those units for? Who are the people that are paying more than half of their income? They're disproportionately low income, and their salaries are obviously lower. So perhaps, right, this is sort of my understanding. And when we look at also the makeup of these households, generally they need more than 1 bedroom. And when we start to, and I think Moses, you also references that kind of wealthier households also have smaller footprints. So if we start to understand this as a kind of scale issue, and the type of housing is needed, there's a very specific kind of housing that's needed that maybe isn't always in the headlines in the New York, that's my opinion, for housing. And so that changes, I think, the way that we think about our need for housing and what we tend to think of New York as made up of, particularly when we start to talk about things like dormitories. It's a very different kind of need.
I mean, wait, can folks hear me? Yeah. One of the biggest advantages New York has is its buildings are flexible and its housing is flexible. And you are all architects, and I'm sure you've all repurposed a building. And you have the stories of Brownstone started as a one-family building and got chopped up into apartments, and maybe got consolidated into 1 unit per each flat. And that is a big advantage, and that lets us do what you're talking about. It lets us adjust to the realities of our housing market in ways that suburb of single-family homes, cannot really do. The problem is twofold. The problem is when we adjust to this, not to kind of help the majority of our population, but when we adjust to it, to help the very wealthy. When we have, housing in neighborhood that's 3 apartments that you consolidate into a single townhome, because somebody who wants to consolidate it into a single townhome is able to outbid 3 people who want to use it as apartments. So that income inequality really skews that incentive in a lot of ways. The second one is when we put this housing into forms that we can't get back, which is another kind of interesting part of it. If you have rental housing and you have a rental housing owner, you can pretty much, if you don't have rent stabilization, and sometimes even if you do, you can reconfigure, you can do things. If you have a multifamily condominium building, it's always going to be a multifamily condominium building. You're not doing an office to residential conversion or a hotel to supportive housing or what have you kind of thing. Single family home you can divide up, you can do things with. Multifamily condo is always multifamily condo. And so we are not ever going to redevelop the Central Park Tower into anything else. It's either going to continue as it is, or it will get tax foreclosed, and who knows what will happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the issue we're talking about here is that there is enormous need, but also enormous costs, particularly for the families you were talking about. And I mean, I think particularly in the New York region, because you mentioned the high cost of development, the scarcity of land, and other issues, it's very difficult to deliver the large apartments. And that's one reason why NYCHA is so important. It's one of the few places where you have large size apartments at very low cost. But this gets back to what we expect affordable housing to do. It's a program that is very limited in terms of what it actually provides in direct incentives compared to public housing, which theoretically should get an annual subsidy, capital infusions, and things like that. So we've relied very heavily on the private sector with a relatively small public component. And what that means is that the private sector looks at what's marketable in a region, what the subsidies will kind of cover, and they like 1-bedrooms or studios and things like that. And there is obviously a market for that in the city as well. But if you're talking about high needs and larger families, and why we have a shelter system which has a growing number of families, it's because the current affordable housing system, while better than in many ways the systems that came before in terms of leverage or maintenance or things like that, it has trouble delivering under this current model, let's say large family apartments. It's just not set up for that.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing I'd say, just to sort of tweak that a little bit, is that for the very low income families, and Hillary, those are the families that you worry most about when 30% of their income is eaten up on rent, because in many cases, and for most of them, it's 50%, because that leaves them very little left for sort of basic necessities. But their incomes can't even cover an operating and maintenance cost, right? And so there's really a structural problem. To adequately house our lowest income New Yorkers, we need subsidies, and we can't pretend otherwise. We can't build our way out of that crisis.
And we may be facing, in terms of affordable housing, I gave a talk recently to the affordable housing group, and it sounds like it's not great there either in terms of the pandemic. We may be facing a situation where we're going to have to recapitalize or go into more recent affordable housing developers as they are unable to collect rents.
Yes. Well, I think this also then raises more questions and further the kind of clarifying the crisis with respect to evictions, which we know leads to greater poverty. And so how do we begin? I don't think we can answer this in this panel, but that this is also part of the thinking around the scope of housing in response. And the question of how do we seek out solutions through professional situations, but also people in their neighborhoods and environment when they're already very vulnerable, worrying about having housing, and yet we're also kind of looking to them for kind of participatory experience is quite challenging in thinking about that. So I don't know if you would like to, we have just maybe 2 minutes. Any last comments? And I think we'll continue the conversation throughout the day, and there will be time for more informal conversation, which was something we had hoped would come from this discussion.
Can I just say 2 things? I'll just say 2 things. One scary and one hopeful, I think, right? Sort of hopeful. One of the scary part is we haven't even mentioned climate change. And I mean, that's a threat to all of us, but it's really a threat to housing affordability. We just looked over the past decade, and I think close to 1 in 5 housing units built over the last decade in New York City are at risk of flooding. They're in the floodplain. They're at risk of flooding in the next 100 years. So we're going to have to figure this out, and that's going to just put a greater squeeze on affordability. So number one. Number two is I think the way out is ultimately, well, maybe I won't. Like, we have to figure out land prices that really, like, we need a commissioner of land, and we need a land tax, and we need to, I think, to really address these structural issues.
I will expand on both of those. Climate change is not only scary, but we have more or less an idea of what to do with climate change and sea level rise and flooding for single family homes. You have buyout programs, it's not without its complications, but we kind of know what we're doing and what we have to do. We have absolutely no idea of how we are going to address climate change for multifamily housing. Nobody has any idea how to do a retreat from a project-based Section 8 or public housing or a Mitchell-Lama or even a regular old multifamily rent-stabilized building. And we have not even started the discussion of how we are going to do it. So that is the even bigger fire I will raise. It's kind of New York City specific. Now I forgot my hopeful one. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll turn it over to Nick.
Well, I'll just briefly mention that in sort of my looking at the history of affordable housing and so forth, I always see it as it can be a very positive dimension for the families who are able to get affordable housing, and we shouldn't forget that. Mm-hmm. While we're unable to basically reset housing markets with affordable housing, I mean, I think that we can say that it's very difficult. The families who are able to benefit from it yield real dividends, and even you were mentioning about eviction, for instance. NYC is basically running a non-eviction policy at this point. And of course, 40% non-payment, but still, that is one of the things that's like holding back a massive wave of homelessness in the city. So there are real benefits to these systems, even though they are not up to resetting, let's say, a regional housing market. And the last thing I would say is join Moses and RPA, and Connecticut's done really. Desegregate Connecticut is unbelievable. I do think we won't probably construct under our current model enough housing to build our way out of it, but certainly by resetting land use in the region, there is real opportunity there. And there are real successes, as both of you pointed out. So.
Absolutely. And in New Jersey, I want to point out in New Jersey that has a statewide program. Not only are they building much more new housing, but when you look at it, and we've done the analysis, the rental prices are more affordable, and the municipalities are less segregated. Noticeably, like statistically noticeably. So we do have a model right across the river that we can follow.
And they're doing a lot of transit-oriented development of it. It's really impressive.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So that history panel set the scene a little bit. We are going to have more time for discussion and Q&A in the later panels. The way we organize this day is you're going to get a presentation from a city official now, from the city perspective, from HPD, and in the it's not the afternoon, this is a condensed morning. A little later, you will get a perspective from a HUD regional manager. But for now, in the times of our nimble times, we are not going to have Adolfo Carrion, who had to be away due to our nimble times. We'll just leave it at that. But we are thrilled to have Ahmed Tigani, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development, to talk to us a little bit, right at the beginning of a new mayoral administration, how HPD sees their work in this area. Ahmed, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. We're actually not going to need it. I don't think I've ever been to an event where I've heard so much and I've been so excited to react to so much that I've wanted to throw out everything that I prepared and talked about. But I'm not, because I'm not crazy. Anyway, good morning. My name is Ahmed Tigani. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Neighborhood Strategies at the New York City Housing Preservation and Development. Our commissioner really wanted to be here today. As many of you know, he is an urban planner by training. And if you keep a municipal leader bingo card, he actually has had every job in housing that you can possibly had. He brings to HPD extensive wisdom from the community level, as a community board, district manager, and a council member, and a borough president. He's worked as a planner at city planning. He's been multiple top federal jobs in the housing sphere, so we're really excited to have him. And he would often tell me and tell us that he was inspired and he was brought into this field by Mario Salvadori, a professor of civil engineering, architecture. It was someone who was a consistent mentor and someone who reminded him what it was to be the consummate urbanist. And I say this because I am an urban planner, but I'm surrounded by some tremendous architects. On my team, I have a member of our Brooklyn planning team here today, Shushma, who is a fantastic architect and someone who contributes a lot to the team. We have a member from our Builds team in development, Brian Balder, who's here today, who is someone I learn from constantly. His experience in architecture makes our planning better. And I say this because throughout HPD, we are incredibly grateful because we try to make sure we match our assets, whether it's financing or land, with something that is not only going to provide people a unit or a place to live, but a statement that we care about them, their outcomes, and where they're going to be in the future. And part of the way we get there is by the inspiration, the thoughtfulness, and the designs that the people in this room have done and will do every day. I think about one project that we're working on recently, Livonia 4. And I think about it because one of the great minds behind it is right there. But it's part of our Brownsville plan, which is an attempt to look, and part of what ONS, my division, does is go to neighborhoods where we have historically not put the investment that we need, look at not just the housing, but look across all the different ways that we should be putting city resources to helping that neighborhood get where they want to go by working with them in developing a plan. And that may include housing, but it also includes, sewer infrastructure and parks and schools. And we come together so that we lay out all the things that need to do in a phased approach. And Livonia 4 is one of these great examples where we're going to build housing that spans the different housing types that the city needs, whether it's supportive or family size or senior. We're going to bring activities that both engage young people and old. We're going to look for new open space, and we're going to do it in a way that is truly an honor to the people who have helped that neighborhood and for the people who will be part of that neighborhood in the future. I say this, with a lot of excitement, but, at least for the last 2 years, 3 years, it's been very tough, us as an industry, to get excited while we also combat the pandemic. The state of the housing emergency has been going on for much longer than that. Our market has been long characterized by low vacancy rates, high rent burden, a tight market in New York City that makes it difficult to meet the challenge of providing the housing units we need for New Yorkers. And nationally, New York City renters have been some of the hardest hit by the pandemic, and it's disproportionately affected our communities of colors. Many reported that they have struggled to pay rent. Homeowners and building owners are worried about paying mortgages. They're worried about higher raising costs. And while COVID didn't create these issues, they've just made it more dire. So it is critical, and this administration, our agency, is steadfast focus on equitable recovery, because we can't ignore that history of disinvestment, and we need to make sure that we're attacking the inequalities head on. We need to make sure that every neighborhood has the housing that meets their needs, including for those who are at the lowest incomes. We need to bring jobs and infrastructure and real assets to these neighborhoods while we bring housing. We cannot think in a silo. We need to sharpen our focus on the most vulnerable, supporting formerly homeless and senior New Yorkers, those with serious mental illness and substance abuse, and helping and those coming out of incarceration, and making sure that they have the services they need and the space they need to thrive and remain stable. We're also committed to increasing the participation of minority and women-owned businesses so that they can grow in size and be part of a more diverse affordable housing industry. Under the leadership of Mayor Adams and Chief Housing Officer Jessica Katz, and in partnership with city agencies and stakeholders, we have looked at and incorporated the feedback of the citywide survey, NYC Speaks. So for those of you who participated, we really do appreciate it. It is something that we are constantly looking at every day. We are using that information to now develop the new housing blueprint that will keep equity at the heart of our work to address the housing crisis in a comprehensive way. As you know, in the executive budget, Mayor Adams committed $22 billion to creating and preserving affordable housing. It's the largest in the city's history. The blueprint will help shape this historic investment in housing, in addition to improving the living conditions of NYCHA, which is front and foremost. Our key priorities include increasing access to affordable home ownership, creating more affordable and supportive housing for New Yorkers experiencing homelessness, improving the quality, sustainability, and resiliency of affordable housing, and I'll add climate resiliency and social resiliency. It's a topic that we need to get more into. There are different types of threats, and we need to make sure that we have the attention and power focused on all of that. A key focus of the blueprint will be reviewing our processes, programs, rules, and regulations to make sure we're identifying unnecessary bureaucratic burdens that keep people in need from accessing the very services supposedly designed to help them. And in this room, trying to get some of that unnecessary regulation so that we can be focused in our conversations with you about how do we make the best design, the best affordable housing we can. And so we look forward to announcing the housing blueprint in the coming weeks and working with many of you in the room and New Yorkers throughout the 5 boroughs to carry it out. As we have a lot of architects and developers in the room, I wanted to highlight 3 priorities for the design of affordable housing that drive our work: engaging neighborhoods in planning, advancing equity in affordable housing design, and building for the future. Communities are central to developing solutions for the future of our neighborhoods. HPD uses its neighborhood planning playbook, which has been here and was created at the beginning of the last administration, to engage local residents in identifying their needs and priorities for sites in their communities. I think another thing important to stress here is that this is not us coming to them and telling them, right? It is important that and this is a key part of the neighborhood planning playbook, that we're providing space for that conversation to go two ways. The playbook is not a prescribed step-by-step motion where we can't alter it or change it. It is changed and shaped by the people we work with, and that is how planning needs to be. We will not build affordable housing, we will not build the trust that we need with communities if we do not give up power and work with others and know it's a joint venture. The great example of that work can be seen throughout the RFPs and the many projects we've awarded over the last 8 years. But I'll say that last week's designation of the Morris House RFP was of a high point for us. This was a high quality, sustainable, mixed-use senior housing proposal on underutilized land on NYCHA's Morris Houses development. Brian Laughlin with MAP Architects, who's moderating the panel later today, was on the team selected for that, and obviously one of the minds that created an incredibly thoughtful proposal that we're calling Soul on Park. The building's site placement, terrace design, and layout of open space were both to optimize the light and air for the new development, the people in the development, and preserve and create a holistic relationship with the NYCHA development, so they don't feel imposed upon, but they feel like they're bringing new neighbors into their community. The development also brings a community health center, nutrition education space, on-site career training connected to CUNY, in healthcare, so emerging technology, and accessibility to both residents and the community at large. There are multiple floors of community space and social services on site, and it's designed with the residents' well-being. These are the kind of thoughtful proposals that we have often seen, and we are starting to see more and more. And it is making it easier for us to make the argument in our communities that we want to work with them and build affordable housing. We also have high standards for our developments. Every new construction, including senior and supportive housing that receives HPD subsidy, is subject to our design guidelines, which if you have not seen or worked with, it's on our website, and we invite you to take a look and always give us your feedback. We update our design guidelines regularly to address current conditions. Most recently, in response to the pandemic, we integrated additional design requirements and recommendations that address equity issues exacerbated during the pandemic, especially around air and ventilation. We introduced broadband where feasible to fight the digital divide highlighted by the working, learning environment we're in now, more people working from home, and people who are homebound trying to access health and other essential services during the pandemic. This aims to incorporate broadband access and serve in our affordable housing projects. We also, as I mentioned earlier, improve ventilation and air quality standards. We also try to advance further sustainability and energy efficiency in our affordable housing production to reduce energy, water, and carbon, while increasing energy efficiency, resiliency, and indoor air quality. We want to keep upping our game to adapt to the threat of climate change, which disproportionately affects marginalized communities. In New York City, 2/3 of all emissions come from buildings, and we need to scale up electrification to reduce emissions. Both the city and the state have ambitious decarbonization goals to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Our new construction is already subject to green building standards, and we're seeing more passive house development in our pipeline. For the existing housing stock, we're working with NYSERDA on an electrification retrofit pilot program, which will help build capacity in our preservation pipeline for decarbonization of existing multifamily affordable housing developments. I think Moses is right. We still need a wider and more robust discussion about what we're going to do to make multifamily buildings part of the solution on climate change. And so in the interim, we're going to take every road we can, including this, to try to contribute to that conversation. But it's not just about decarbonization. We need to build climate resilient housing as temperatures, precipitation, and sea levels continue to rise to keep residents and communities safe. We have a great challenge before us when it comes to tackling housing and affordability crisis, but crisis and constraints can create creativity and innovation. One of the greatest resources we have are the people who make up this industry. That's where I started, and that's where I'd like to end. We have a great team at HPD who have stepped up time and time again to strengthen our efforts to serve New Yorkers, especially through the pandemic. And we have no doubt that we are stronger when we hear and work with you on trying to make these issues happen in the sphere of the real. We are starting to rebuild our agency with the leadership that this administration has put in our agency and throughout government. It is not a plan that directly comes out of our team, but I do want to mention, I know many of you know, the Rebuild, Renew, and Reinvest plan. That is a 5-pillar, 70-initiative plan to put our economy back on an equitable roadmap that brings people and connects them to jobs that are both careers and connects them to emerging industries. It focuses on an economic recovery that not only looks at jobs in the buildings, but also how do you improve the public realm so it participates in that endeavor. We are investing in our neighborhoods and our commercial nodes like Hunts Point to make sure that our food system and that part of our industry is secure. And we've also launched a New York City Strategy for Equity and Economic Recovery Fund, otherwise known as SEED, that will be a capital planning framework to go along with the kind of holistic neighborhood planning I mentioned earlier. As we start to rebuild, I also want to mention, because I'm in this group and there are several of you who will find me after if I don't say this, there are initiatives that we do love and want to get back to, including big ideas for small lots. Is something that we work on closely with a number of members of AIA. It is going to be something that helps us think about how we open up and activate those hard-to-build lots. And I think it's going to be a part of what we can do when we're at a place where we have more staff and we're ready to move forward. So I want to thank you for what you've done already to help us get that idea forward. And I want to tell you that we have work to do to keep that going. Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you. Please know that HPD, especially our Office of Neighborhood Strategies, is always open to meet, sit, talk, hear your ideas. Again, we'll only have the fruitful partnership if it's two ways. Have a great rest of your event and look forward to a great recovery.
Thrilled to have moderator Brian Laughlin, AIA APA of Magnuson Architects and Planning, also co-chair of our AI New York Housing Committee, and really helped us pull this conference together with the rest of the committee. So thrilled to get into the next panel. Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. This is, as a lot of people have already kind of mentioned, the product of a lot of conversations, a lot of hard work, and a lot of really smart people. One of my favorite books is the Andy Warhol Diaries, where he, instead of interviewing folks, he kind of works under this premise that the best way to get to the root of a particular issue is just to stick a couple of really smart people in a room together and just get them to talk it through. So that's a lot of what we're trying to achieve today. The panel that was just up here, I think if we put together a dream team of folks that know a lot about housing from an academic perspective, a historic perspective, a statistical perspective, I don't know we could have put together a better dream team than those three. So I hope that was as kind of incredible for you as it was for those of us who put it together. It was really marvelous. So are we convinced? Or is it can we say crisis now? Is that okay? That's a term we're allowed to use. I think that's really important though, because we were talking about this in another. Another panel earlier this week, and the question was raised is, can we talk about this as a housing crisis, or is that just hyperbolic? And I think some of the stuff that was on these screens, and don't worry, we have no more slides, but on these screens earlier today, really do illuminate the fact that it is, from all kind of, I don't know, objective accounts or subjective accounts, very much a crisis that we're in the middle of. Some of the comments that were made around the beginning of this current mayoral administration was that this mayor was actually inheriting the worst housing crisis in the history of the city, depending on how you would even begin to measure that sort of thing. The second point, though, I want to make with regard to this concept of a housing crisis is that it elevates the conversation, right? If we start to talk about this as a housing crisis, it kind of energizes the room. I know I'm preaching to a choir. You're a very self-selecting audience. You wouldn't be here if you didn't at least were marginally on the fence about the fact that this is in fact a housing crisis. But we need to start talking about housing in that way. If you think about 10 years ago, post-Sandy, the way that we finally started talking about sustainability and resiliency in terms of a crisis and all the things that have happened, even just in the housing sector, even just in the building industries and the building trades, we've made tremendous progress. We still have a very long way to go, but the start of that, I would argue, is that post-Sandy moment for this city where we really started to think about sustainability and resiliency as a crisis. I'm challenging this room and everybody that you talk to after today to start to really think about housing as a crisis, so that we can energize, that we can get those great ideas, we can start to innovate and really move the conversation around housing in that direction, because I think it's extremely, extremely necessary. I want to put a couple of things out there. Ahmed, by the way, if you don't know who Ahmed is before today, you will know after today. Ahmed is fantastic, and we've had the privilege of working with him and his team for a while now. But one of the things he threw out there was the mayor's commitment of $22 billion with a B, of financial resources from the city dedicated to subsidized housing. And the immediate response, not just from a couple of folks in the public, from city council, from all the housing advocacy groups, from all these different academics and folks who study this sort of thing, universally, all of those folks said, it's not enough. That's the scale of the crisis that we're talking about, that $22 billion, that the general consensus is that we need more. The last two administrations leading up to this one, over the past 20 years, have committed to targets of an aggregate of 460,000 units of either constructed or preserved affordable housing. And we still are in a position where that's not enough. So if those two things don't say crisis to you, they definitely say crisis to me. Let's talk afterward. I'll see if I can pull out a couple other statistics, but I think it is definitely a crisis. One other thing I want to talk about is I want to go back to a point that Ben made where he said, here we are, Center for Architecture, a bunch of designers, planners, architects. What are we doing talking about economics and policy? I think that's a really important point, because I would say that, no sooner can you design or plan housing that's affordable without understanding economics and policy. Could you design housing without understanding gravity or bricks or daylight or air? So it's really important that our design community, as planners, as architects, as designers, understand these pieces, these other tools, these other components. I'm going to use this as kind of a segue to introduce our panel. There's a term that gets used a lot, especially when we talk about affordable housing, and that's public-private partnerships. And I have a huge issue with that concept, or at least the way that it gets used, is because you do definitely have representation of the state or the city, right, in that public component. And we definitely have representation of the private in terms of developers and equities and capital that get puts into these deals. But the part that I always feel like is missing in that 3P construct is, and I'm just going to use it because it's another P, but people, right? It's the communities that we build these projects in, these affordable housing developments in. That's the piece that's been missing from this conversation. In large part, and I definitely applaud folks at HPD, the Office of Neighborhood Strategies, and a lot of the other city agencies, And a lot of other developers that we work with. We have our office has the privilege of working with a lot of nonprofits and really community-focused groups that have been trying very hard to pull that third P, the people part, into it. And I would say that those are the three big tools that we really need to think about when we're thinking about affordable housing, is the public piece, the city, the state, the private piece, the equity and the capital, and then the people piece. The communities and the neighborhoods that these things are, that these projects are being realized in. So with that, I'm really thrilled to have a panel made up of each one of the three Ps. So the first person I'm going to invite to the stage, or actually I'll invite everybody all at once, but we're going to be joined. So actually Karen and Senator, yes, if you would come up, and Jamie, I saw you somewhere else. If the three of you would not mind joining me up on stage, and I'll run through your a very short version of your amazing bios as I do that. So, Ms. Blondell, who is immediately to my left. Yeah, feel free to clap. By all means. So Ms. Blondell, again, the list is very long, but she is currently a Loeb Fellow up at the GSD, and she's founder and executive director of the Public Housing Civic Association, and I think I can say this, a proud resident of Red Hook houses. And we'll talk about why Red Hook is kind of special in a minute. We also have to her left Jamie Smar, who is the Senior Vice President of the NHP Foundation. And then to Jamie's left, we have Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who is the Chair of the Committee on Housing and Construction and Community Development, and the Senator from the 26th District. So thanks to you all for joining us today. And I'm going to stop talking at the mic and come sit down with you guys. That's your cue. Did we get it? Yeah. All right, cool. All right, so what I'd like to do is, staying within that construct of those three Ps, right, adding the third, if I could ask each one of you to talk about how, Senator Kavanaugh, in your particular case, how the public is part of the affordable housing process.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, being here today for this important topic. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you for the introduction. I do want to start with something that you were just talking about, which is the notion of talking about this as a crisis. It is indeed a crisis. I've been actually trying to emphasize two things rhetorically as a matter of communicating with the public. First of all is, I was the policy director for the New York City homeless shelter system many years ago, and we used to talk frequently about ending homelessness. And if you look around now, people rarely talk about that as an ambition. They talk about improving the shelters, they talk about additional services. To the extent homelessness is a problem of lack of affordable housing, which it is, although it's also, there are many other problems that interlock with that problem. We really need to think about being ambitious and treating it as the tremendous crisis it is. And what I've been talking about is there are three really intersecting crises. They are the crises of affordable housing, it's the crisis of homelessness, and it's the crisis of eviction. And I think the work of Matt Desmond and others has made people understand just how destructive the frequent eviction that people experience is. And so we've had a lot of advocacy over many years at the state level that was fairly narrowly aimed at things that they thought could be done in a context where you had a Democratic Assembly that was ostensibly interested in addressing these things and was New York City based, and then you had a Republican-controlled Senate that was largely based outside New York City and substantially, let's say, less interested in addressing these things, and a lot of horse trading around sort of modest ambitions. Beginning in 2019, we passed something called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which is, politicians exaggerate, this is the strongest piece of tenant protection legislation that has passed anywhere in America in the last half century. And it is fundamentally designed to stabilize our existing rental stock and to dramatically reduce evictions. And it did that in the latter half of 2019. You saw a dramatic reduction of evictions, not just in New York City, but in places like Buffalo. The next phase of that needs to be expanding development of housing. That means the kind of spending you're talking about, and I agree more, and also a greater emphasis, I would say, on rent subsidies, not just capital development, and I would also say more flexibility and room full of architects, more flexibility in what is possible in terms of conversions, in terms of different forms of housing. So looking forward to talking about that. But I would say that I think the general public has never been more engaged than they are in this moment, and I think COVID did a lot of things. One of the things it did is really make people think a lot about residential space, the importance of that, the importance of stability. So I think it really is a good moment to be doing this, and I'm glad to hear you emphasizing the crisis, the need for a crisis level response.
Jamie, can you talk about the private piece of the kind of the affordable housing construct and the private equity piece and why that's so important to that set of factors or players or stakeholders?
Well, sure. First of all, I want to say that the NHP Foundation we're a not-for-profit developer that we actually are active in 17 states. And one of the things I will say that New York does really well is that you have a very good consensus about why we need to do affordable housing that really does not exist a lot of places. So I always preface my remarks by saying, you are not what I call a banana jurisdiction, which is a build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, because we actually we work in some of those jurisdictions. So the fact that we start here with a general consensus that this is something we must do, that we must address, is something we should not take for granted. And just again, the fact that we can count on a reliable stream of resources from both the city and the state to pair with private equity to get housing projects done, it's something that we can take for granted, and that you cannot take for granted in other jurisdictions that we work in. I won't name those jurisdictions because someone might actually see this, but again, I also worked for the Department of Education for a decade, and I can tell you that even when we start to have the discussions about locating affordable housing versus locating schools, that you generally start from a consensus that no, we need to do this. Whereas I've had many people fight me on locating school projects. There's still not even that consensus in the 5 boroughs that we need a middle school. Well, don't put that near me, but I rarely encounter any resistance to a new affordable project. It's something that I think that we can reliably count on, and we now have a robust network of CDFIs that are giving us bridge financing, that are giving us conventional equity to pair with what the city and the state are also putting out there on an annual basis. So I do think that's again, it's something we can reliably count on.
That's great. Karen, can you talk a little bit about your organization and what role it's playing in trying to bring the public more into this kind of public-private partnership and the role you see the public having there?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Public Housing Civic Association was created because I saw a need for public housing to have its own voice. Public housing in New York City is 1 in 15 New Yorkers. They were called essential workers a few months ago. But what I'm saying is I've seen people graduate from school and go on and leave public housing. But the fact of the matter is we still need public housing in New York City. Public housing is not affordable housing. Affordable housing is a totally different program. And it's like a pet peeve of mine when I hear people continue to mix public housing, which is low-income housing, and affordable housing. Those are 2 different money streams. Now, with Brad and PAC, rental assistance demonstration, There is a public-private partnership. PAC is the vehicle that it's delivered by. It's a permanent, affordable commitment together by pre-qualified developers, housing managers, and social services. Excuse me. But there still lies a problem in public housing with actually talking to the tenants. So I heard someone say that RAD was the only way. RAD is not the only way. I've been working and moving the preservation trust language for about 2 years now. Why? Because when I first heard trust NYCHA, I was like, trust who? There's no way I'm gonna trust NYCHA. But that didn't stop me from doing the research. You know, technically, none of us want receivership, but the real rule is that if you can't fix public housing, it goes into receivership. They came up with public-private partnerships. I didn't like it at first. It has moved a lot, but I don't think it's for all developments. Some turnkey developments are easier for you to convert, but a place like Red Hook, that we have 20 acres of land, low-rising buildings, mostly 6 stories, built during a time when World War II, we needed fallout shelters. We don't need to convert that to privatization. We need to have the public trust and a public benefit to move that forward and to keep public housing public. The problem is we don't get enough information from an unbiased party. Either we're getting it from someone who has an agenda, or we're getting it from somebody who is gonna get something out of it. The Public Housing Civic would be an IRB. It would be tasked at giving out the information clearly on RAD, clearly on the Preservation Trust, and what happens if you do nothing. And so it's gonna be a model in that form. I would love to start bringing some of you in to talk to some of the residents so that they can start understanding physical needs assessment. Because for all you know, because you don't live there, those physical needs assessments could be double dipping. We have to take a look at that from the ground. I'm the one whose window needs to be repaired. I'm the one whose trap is not working. I'm the one who lives in a building where they never changed the filter. You have to let us talk to you. And I'll stop right there.
So I want to come back to some of those points. There is a model that a lot of planners use, and it's called Arnstein's ladder, and it was developed in the '60s, and it was introduced by a woman that was part of a couple of different presidential administrations. And Arnstein's ladder, it talks about community engagement, and it starts at the very bottom, where you effectively ignore the community, you just do whatever you want. And then you kind of move up that ladder, and it's like, okay, we'll talk to the community, fine. And then it becomes placating, then it becomes genuine involvement, then it becomes ownership and leadership. Where do you, I know I'm gonna resent asking or asking this question, but where do you think we are now? And where do you, in terms of what's the public engagement, especially around public housing, but around affordable housing in communities in New York City at a larger scale? And what do you think needs to happen to get us up that ladder so we have more residents being involved in decision making, more residents being involved in control, and even more residents involved in ownership?
Mm-hmm. So I use crisis, not fear, crisis. And so just looking back at the history of redlining, when we see what the attack is, we also see a counterattack. And so every time we have a climate crisis, that's another opportunity for us to gather the community and to speak using climate, because the water is not going to stop across the street because you're in a penthouse and I'm on the other side in public housing. We still have some things together that we have to deal with, the amenities in the community, transportation, energy. Mold is going to be a continual thing happening unless you come up with some walls that are 100% mold free. We also have grandfathered in properties all across New York that have mold, that have lead, that has asbestos. Every time we go through a climate crisis, those things get exposed more and more. So we won't be able to keep grandfathering things in. I think we need to build a climate core of young people who can actually be taught how to abate, how to remediate, and how to inspect for these things, because they're going to happen over and over again. If we can get people involved, it doesn't have to be just them taking care of public housing, but the greater community.
You can clap. That's okay. Senator, one of the things that the current administration, the gubernatorial administration, recently announced was a plan for 100,000 units of new housing, either constructed or preserved, half in the city and half in the rest of the state. That signaled to a lot of folks that this is a kind of a new chapter in the state's involvement. In a lot of ways, I would say that the state has been almost like a silent partner. Obviously, a tremendous amount of funding comes through, and there's a number of different regulatory things that go through the state. But for the most part, it's allowed New York City to kind of do its thing. What do you see in that new chapter of the state's involvement in affordable housing?
I think there is a new commitment to taking greater ownership at the state level of being responsible for being a partner. And by the way, in New York City, but especially in other parts of the state. I mean, in other parts of the state, really, the state is the primary driver of producing greater affordability. New York City is blessed with a huge kind of infrastructure, huge capacity for developing projects locally, and both in the private and the public sector here. One thing we're trying to do is make sure that the prior governor announced a 5-year capital plan. It was about 6 years ago, and then there was sort of, in the usual way of Albany, there was a dispute about when it started and which was year 1 and which was year 0 or something. But it was sort of done. It was announced. It was kind of a I think it was a good announcement, but sort of to some extent a public relations moment where they're like, we're going to do a lot, and then very few sort of metrics on an ongoing basis and kind of accountability about what kinds of units were going to be produced, where, how much we were going to spend, how quickly were the starts and the completions happening. So we did build into our 5-year plan legislation now a sort of an annual reporting process that we hope will kind of, frankly, raise expectations. That the state is expecting to get this many starts this year, and this is how we're doing toward some goals which are ambitious but achievable. We did in this budget authorize $5.5 billion of direct capital spending, and another $2.5 billion in operating funds, including $1 billion in rental assistance to sort of try to get us out of the sort of hangover of COVID rent arrears. But I do think this governor, we had a prior governor who was the former HUD secretary, but in a way, I think this administration is signaling more that they want to sort of be front and center and out there, and really committing to addressing the affordable housing crisis. And you saw that not just in those spending proposals, but in a number of ambitious proposals that were proposed with the budget, which did not get enacted. We have 20 days left in the session. Maybe some of them will be, but to address transit-oriented development, accessory dwelling units, lifting the FAR cap in New York City. So you're seeing an administration that is and conversion of hotels, which I'm still working on. But you're seeing an administration that does really in the governor's office that really does seem to be trying to take on the problem from a variety of perspectives. So I am hoping we'll see continuing leadership there.
So, Jamie, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. What aren't they looking at? What the senator just mentioned ADUs, FAR caps, tackling lots of other policy issues. Is there something else that from the private side that you would hope that the state would start to look at?
I actually think the real thing that, if we're talking about a crisis, is really maybe not a state policy thing. But by the way, in terms of like triumphs, I think that we should all acknowledge that, even in the 23 years when I first moved to New York, what a triumph mandatory inclusionary housing is.
Yeah.
When I first started at HPD 2 decades ago, I ran the zoning incentive program, and mandatory inclusionary housing was voluntary then.
Yeah.
And so we've moved from that construct to making it mandatory. So I think that's something everyone in this room should take credit for, that that we're now one of the few municipalities with a mandatory inclusionary housing program. But the thing that I think that we're missing is really what I would call a mismatch of affordability. And I'll tell it to you this way. I recently met a family that I encouraged to apply for one of the housing lotteries. So household of two, and I said, this is something you should be interested in. And they flatly looked at me and said, we can't afford that rent. We cannot afford $1,300 rent for a one-bedroom apartment, which was what the housing lottery was offering. So I'm not sure we're getting it right. There are still factors within the 5 boroughs that make not even a $1,300 rent affordable for someone earning $55,000, $60,000 a year. I have some ideas about what those are. I mean, New York City is one of only 2 of the largest 20 municipalities with an income tax, and it's a regressive income tax. It applies on the first dollar of your income, up to 4% of your income. All these things, I call them the night of 1,000 cuts. The 10-cent bag tax that's now 50 cents a bag. The fact that New York City has the most expensive parking fines and fees of any city in the world. So the parking tickets here are more expensive than London and Hong Kong.
Wow.
Literally the most expensive parking tickets on the globe. The fact that Indian Point recently closed, and that's thought that it's going to drive up utility costs, and Con Ed bills are already high. So it's all these little factors that lead a household of 2 to say, even that lottery apartment, I can't afford it, $1,300.
Yeah.
So we need a more detailed study of affordability at the household level in the 5 boroughs, I think. I think it's critical, because I think we're still missing something. That 30% of your income, you should be able to afford this at 30% of your income. You're still missing a lot of households.
Yes. Yeah.
Cannot. And I don't think that's a state thing. I think that's probably a more city-led study.
Well, I think it also ties into a critique I hear of affordable housing, which I think is a completely valid one. That's usually public-driven or community-driven, of affordable to whom. And it's largely based on the fact that we're using area median incomes for the New York City metro region, and then applying it to a neighborhood like Brownsville or to a neighborhood in the Central Bronx, where your median incomes are dramatically lower than that metro city region. And affordability is hinged to that metro region AMI. So is that, and one of the things, we as New Yorkers, we get kind of like inward focusing, and it's important. I think Moses reminded us, there is a state across the water that's doing some of these things pretty well. And there's a city down the turnpike called Washington, D.C., where a lot of these other decisions get made that we pretend don't necessarily affect us, but they actually do. That AMI piece is structured by HUD. Is that something we need to really open back up and rethink how that gets applied?
Well, I mean, I think that policy authority already exists. There's small area median income analysis that HUD does allow you to do for rental subsidies. But I mean, the essential framework of saying you can always, if you're paying 30% of your income, it's affordable. I'm just not sure that works for New York. I don't know, because of these other factors that we don't ever talk about. We know we're an expensive city, but we don't know how it actually translates into can you afford the rent that's on that housing lottery.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of what you're saying. So in public housing, our rent is based off of 30% of our income. They use the word adjusted, but the adjustment is very small. So we also, the second rent is 80% of fair market rate. So when I look at the fair market rate in New York, it is not in sync with the rest of the country. So as I try to gain more employment or start my own business, and New York City Housing Authority does not have a ceiling on the rent, but has this 80%, that is a moving target. And so I remember telling my son that when I was younger, I thought I could work myself out of public housing. You know, I was like, I didn't have college. I was like, but there's libraries, and I'll learn how to use a computer, and I'll make a little more money. And it seemed like every time I did that, the carrot would move further out in front of me. And here I am now, 40 years, pretty much the whole time in the same apartment where I've seen no capital improvements. Literally, if they open up the outlet, the wiring is going to crumble in their hands. Literally, the stacks and the chase walls are not getting the attention that it needs along the traps. So we're getting backups. I found out really early that I could not sit in my bathtub because I lived on the first floor. I had something like coal tar coming up. And when I asked for pumps to be put in the basement or for traps to be cleaned, it's not that easy to get those type of improvements because nobody's listening to the public housing resident. So this is what led me, this was desperation that led me to start the Public Housing Civic Association. I was going to the not elected officials, to the resident councils, and I was just meeting walls, you know, where people were only helping select people. And we do remember that public housing was built segregated and on select people. Even when it was all white, you had to be a good white. You know what I'm saying? You had to have certain things in a row. You had to be married, you know, you had to have your house cleaned. There were rules. And so all of that has caused this stigma on public housing, when in actuality, we need to deaggregate how much people are paying, because public housing gets 504, which is additional subsidy for people who are handicapped. They get 202 for seniors. So where's all of this money going, and why is it not affordable? And why can't I stay in my own neighborhood without being veil-penned in public housing? And I'm born here in New York City. That is an atrocious way to treat people who are native to New York. We all love New York. And it's also a sanctuary city. So we do have to factor in that if we are a sanctuary city, people are gonna run here for safety. We have to think about all of that. And one good thing is to take public housing out of the equation. I shouldn't be up here begging for money every year. I shouldn't have to go to state senate every year or state assembly, or, you know, it should be automatic that we get some money to sustain public housing.
So one of the things that you touch on, and I think, Jamie, you started to allude to, I want to kind of put it out to the group. There's a concept that has been getting more traction in the field of community development called community wealth building. And some of the tools in community wealth building have been cited as affordable home ownership. Other tools might be community land trusts. But ultimately, the concept is, how do we get money that's coming out of real estate development to stay in the communities that are being developed, as opposed to that money that's being made in real estate development actually going out to somewhere else?
Well, I'd like to throw in a plug for some of the renters equity programs that I've seen nationwide. So they're limited, but I think that they have the potential to do a lot of good, where you're talking about community wealth building. So there are some programs that actually recognize that we have long-term renters in these properties and reward them with a form of equity for being a long-term tenant. So for every month that they've paid their rent, a small portion of that rent actually goes into an equity account for that person, and they vest after a number of years, and that money can be used for anything. So in some states, you're required to use it. If you want to use that account, you have to use it for a home purchase. But we've seen other models where the renter can use it for a car down payment, college tuition, buy furniture. Again, it's like any other person, if you have equity in your home, you can use it for whatever you want. And again, it's rewarding those long-term renters who have been here and have contributed to the material well-being of that property by being in residence for years or even decades. So I'm definitely a big proponent of renters' equity, and I think that's something we need to have more of a discussion around.
I think you mentioned community land trust. I think there are some interesting opportunities around that. I actually have a lot of my constituents in Chinatown are very interested in trying to figure out. You've got these very old buildings. They're affordable. The apartments at quite low incomes. Much of the value of the buildings is in the commercial storefronts, which of course have struggled in the last couple of years because of reductions in foot traffic and visitors to Chinatown. But a lot of the property, they're decades old, many decades old property owners, often owned by the kind of these family associations that are like the collective leadership of Chinatown, and they want to continue to maintain the property as affordable housing. They don't want to kind of monetize it and get the maximum rent, but the economics of that are very hard, and there are proposals to try to it would be complicated, but effectively transfer ownership of the residential components of these buildings to some kind of a collective, like a land trust style thing. It would require some initial funding to do that, but that might be a model that allows you to, without giving ownership to individual residents of their particular unit. Frankly, with some of the capital needs, the unit that you may not be doing somebody a favor by turning their unit over to them, but creating some kind of a more collective community approach that allows a real sense of ownership and the reality of ownership at the community level. And so I think there are good opportunities there as well.
What are some other things that we should be thinking about putting on the table from a affordable housing, if this is a crisis, right? If you think about, again, using the analogy I drew to what we started to put on the table post-Sandy from a sustainability standpoint, recognizing that it was interesting, like we all knew cars were a problem, right? But I don't think a lot of us were quite aware of how much buildings were a problem. I'm not sure we all were aware of how much beef is a problem, and the agricultural industry and aspects of that. What are some other things that, if we're now in a crisis mode, we can really start to put on the table as stuff that we need to look at?
I'll just brag and say I became a vegetarian for ethical and environmental reasons in 2009. So I'm ahead of the curve on the beef. I would say, though, I alluded to this before. We've got to rethink the role of restrictive regulations, restrictive zoning, and you were talking about the hierarchy of community participation, but the ability of banana. I love this acronym.
Yeah.
I use it frequently now. But the ability of people with that impulse to prevent the housing we need, and I would say especially in the suburbs. This really is a regional problem. I think you have, I don't know, you may have others on your panel, in some of the panels today are going to talk about this, but the U.S. produces about 34 units per 100,000 residents per year. 34 units per 1,000 residents per year. New York metropolitan area, the number is something in the low 20s, 21, 22. New York City in the metropolitan area has actually done fairly well in recent years, and a lot of efforts to produce, a lot of rezoning, all that stuff, which have been controversial. The suburbs of New York City are disastrously failing to produce meaningful amounts of housing. So that number in Nassau and Suffolk County is about 7. They're producing 7 units per 1,000 residents, which does not even allow the children of the people who are living there right now to stay on Long Island and have housing. The suburbs of New York City that are in New Jersey, rather than in New York State, are producing housing at a higher rate, partly because of very long-term interventions, Mount Laurel court-related interventions and executive agency interventions. We are the only state in America with a housing market like New York that is so tight that has not had a state-level intervention in the ability of localities to be wildly restrictive and prevent housing. And that's some of the stuff the governor was proposing, which again did not happen this year. And it's politically very complicated. We all love home rule and local control, but it is local control of the people who live in these places to some extent at the expense of other people who might want to live in these places. I would just note that with respect to Long Island, and I love Long Island, and many of my friends are Long Islanders, as they say, but Long Island, we also had a huge investigation of fair housing discrimination. We found that in half of cases, Newsday did great work on this, in half of cases where somebody walked into a realtor's office, they faced very specific, aggressive discrimination based on race and ethnicity in, this day and age, 49% of people who are Black, Latino, or Asian experienced steering. Basically, if you haven't read this, Newsday they published the video of this. It is a phenomenal bit of journalism, but it is astonishing that. And we had an investigation. We subpoenaed, and we don't subpoena a lot of people. We subpoenaed all the brokers involved in this and came up with a pretty good fair housing package last year. But the impulse not to allow people to build housing, not to allow people to build multifamily housing, not to allow people to build rental housing, and always couched in the character of the community, the capacity of the infrastructure, the sewer, the transit. Those are all real issues, but we do need to get beyond that. And if I can just stay on the soapbox for another 30 seconds. California took the opportunity provided by COVID of hundreds of hotels that are not being used now and are not going to be used for the foreseeable future. They acquired a lot of them, and they are in the process of converting them to affordable housing. New York, we put $200 million in the budget in the last couple of years. It's a start, but what we need to do is make the processes of converting them less restrictive. I'm trying to get this done in the next 20 days, but basically more flexible, basically allow them to continue to use the existing C of O with some assurances that you're going to have the amenities necessary for permanent housing, and zoning flexibility. Our bill says if it's within 400 feet of a place that's zoned for housing, but not in a place for zoned for housing, you don't need a zoning change, you can just do it. There are hotels that are going to be shuttered for the foreseeable future in New York that are sitting empty. The city can do family shelters or homeless shelters as of right in those sites. We can't convert them to permanent housing in an affordable way. That is an enormous opportunity, and there are others like that.
I would just quickly add, in terms of crisis mode type things, land is such a resource in the 5 boroughs. I would greatly encourage people to go look at the Board of Education. The Board of Education owns almost 1,700 properties. Most of them are greatly underbuilt. And I think I can say this because I worked there a decade.
I was going to say.
And, if there were more agency coordination within the administration, there could be a look at which of those sites could actually serve a sort of mixed-use schools and housing, an affordable housing component. But somebody owns 1,700 pieces of property, I would probably go look at sort of in the inventory.
Is it the
We
second
didn't hear
largest?
from you.
We didn't hear from you.
And finally, I was looking at some models in Cambridge and in Boston, and one of the things they did was they're allowing their homeowners to build taller without having to go through a zoning change. They just put a blanket policy over the county that allows them to do this to increase density, because they also have homeless problems there. So that's something we could think about. I feel a little more comfortable with that in areas that I know we have, shallow groundwater tables and flooding, than to have people in basements dying like they did in the last hurricane. Maybe we could think about actually letting those communities build up as opposed to using existing, which will still be a problem going forward with climate change. So.
Well, I'd like to point out that we're about to end on time.
Oh yeah.
Okay. All right. How do we want to structure questions from the audience? So I would ask that if you do have a question, that you raise your hand, and then you state your name, you state where you're from, what you're doing, what your interest is, why you're here, something like that, and one sentence. All right? No run-ons. One sentence.
With a question mark at the end.
Yes, with a question mark, it goes up. Yeah.
Back here.
Hello, thank you. Brian for the challenge, ending with a question. My name is Jessica Morris. I am an architect by training. I co-chair the Planning and Urban Design Committee at AIA New York. I also do some community board work up in East Harlem, and I'm a practitioner. So the sentence, and Proust is a favorite, a sentence that ends in a question mark. So acknowledging the crisis point and moving from crisis acknowledgement to crisis response, it seems like suggesting that a process audit would be the slowest point of action we could possibly take. But process audit precedes process change. And my understanding is that throughout this delivery of housing, the processes that cause the challenge of equal access are what stymie progress. My question is, based on an observation that access to affordable units as it relates to the stability of applicants at lower bands of affordability, when you are counting the pennies in your pocket, but you're needing to come up with documentation that gets you in the door, that level of stability for so many people is out of reach. Is a process audit in a crisis response mode the way to start towards a process change, is the question. And where would that start?
I don't know if process audit is a term of art that others know, but is there a particular process you want, a particular process you want to kind of audit and reconsider, or just the general process by which we produce affordable?
Yeah, let's frame it as that. Is there a piece of the way in which we deliver affordable housing, that process? Do we need to do an audit of that?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the obstacles and the delays in producing affordable housing and the barriers to doing it in a generally more equitable way are fairly well known, and I would not, reviewing, analyzing, studying is always important, but I don't think we need that kind of study before taking aggressive action. I think that we have a massive crisis. Telling people we have 92,000 people who are homeless at any given moment, probably definitely a great many, larger number of people who experience homelessness during the course of a year. We know how to produce programs. I think Muzzy's Rosenblatt's going to talk later, or maybe has spoken already. There are lots of people that are going to have lots of ideas about how to do that. I think we need to make sure we're putting in the resources, and we need to diminish obstacles, and we need to engage communities, but we also need to make sure we're not giving communities veto power over projects that are critical. There needs to be a full engagement and assess people's concerns and needs and try to address them. But I think we need to move much more rapidly than and I think telling people we need an audit first is probably not the messaging we need to convey the urgency.
Yeah, just quickly, the thing I heard in the question there was, I have encountered people who are sometimes not getting access to mortgages, lotteries, because they don't have what's called traditional income. And we have a lot more and more so-called 1099 employees that they're not going to get a W-2 because they don't have a traditional job.
Right.
So maybe our systems need to catch up to that reality. And even my son, he drives Uber to make money. So I don't know how our systems are treating those type households, but we need to catch up to that and very quickly, because that's the reality of the situation now.
Yeah, I've in other conversations with people far smarter than I have said that the access to housing problem is actually an access to credit problem, and whether that's whether it's traditional forms of income, whether it's your credit score, but that's we should be looking at if we're going to interrogate any part of the housing delivery system or process. It's how people are evaluated from a credit perspective.
But I think we should also have a housing vacancy law, because I've seen housing, there's a building, it has to be empty over 25 years, a brand new building. And so many times I was like, when I was having problems in my public housing unit, I should go squat in that building because it remains empty. I don't know how this formula works with tax credits, but some kind of way that needs to be looked at again. But if people could be homeless in New York and others could have homes that sit vacant, we have to find out why.
Yeah, it's a great point.
The methods of funding affordable housing through syndicated tax credits and other.
Hang on, if you could just say who you are.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Terrence Curry. I'm a professor at Tsinghua University in Shenzhen, and I run a nonprofit in the Community Development Center in Brooklyn. So the question is is it possible to explore? I know it's possible. I just like to toss it out there. Alternatives to paying rent. It seems to be what we all talk about when we talk about affordable housing is subsidized rent. But rent is only one way of paying for housing. And are there any innovations out there or alternative ways of thinking about how to pay for housing outside of paying monthly rent?
Okay.
I mean, Terry and I go way, way back. And I've never been invited to the university on it. But no, I mean, for starters, the most obvious answer is to focus on who's paying the rent. I mean, we know that I'm actually going to disagree a little bit with Jamie, even though one of the effects of one of his comments was to let me off the hook at the state level. To the extent 30% is a rough challenge for a lot of people, it's because wage policy has not kept up with costs, and that's straightforward state issue, and also healthcare costs are the single biggest component, and that's something the state ought to be addressing and can, and I would start doing that. But we also know, we have the housing vacancy survey, we know that a great many people in the city are paying 50% of their entire gross income on rent. We know that a very substantial fraction are exceeding that 30% limit. The most direct way to do it is to subsidize it, and we have programs like SCREE and DREE, which freeze people's rents if they're older or the head of household has a disability. It was a massive challenge to get the maximum income for that program a number of years ago to be raised from $29,000 to $50,000. People thought if you make $30,000, we shouldn't be giving you the benefit of that program, which is crazy in New York. It's now been $50,000 for 7 or 8 years. We have programs that can transfer the burden of covering costs from tenants to others.
Senator, my mate, I love calling you Senator. Senator, behind the question is that's a lot of money that's out of pocket that's not building any kind of private equity, and rent really is a one direction to fund housing, which the renter really in the long term gets no benefit in terms of long term wealth building. And perhaps this is part of the crisis is that we continue to see the funding of housing really only in one way, either subsidize or rent anyway, but it's not the value of the housing that the poor or the marginal communities are living in. They don't benefit from the value after putting years and years and years and years and years of funding back into it.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly, but I mean, we do have lots of programs that are intended to be cooperative ownership. We have HDFCs, we have the Mitchell-Lama program, which is, by the way, Mitchell and Lama are geniuses of self-marketing, because 70 years ago they passed a law, and we still talk about their names. But we actually have a substantial amount of money in this capital that we just got out there that is intended to create homeownership opportunities for lower income. So like partial equity, building limited equity over time is also a really big opportunity.
I want to build on that. I'll pretend I'm a panelist for a second. I mean, Jamie, you were talking about rent equity programs, which I think fall into that category. Another thing that that got pointed out by Eric Enderlin of HTC in a conversation we were having earlier this week was that at the beginning of the pandemic, when we started talking about direct subsidy to households, everyone was like, well, we don't know what they're going to spend their money on. We don't know what they're going to do with it. We really should, the pushback on that concept. They effective, no, you can't cast everything with a single brush, but the vast majority of people that received that benefit paid the rent with it. So to your point, Senator, that the direct subsidy, even at a household level, is I think definitely an alternate to just straight rent payment, and something that we should really consider as we kind of mull over ideas like right to housing in addition to right to shelter. All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Well, can I just say one other thing? So when you talk about cost burden, a lot of times when people hear the 30% rule, they go, they're okay. They're only paying 30% of their income. But there are outside cost burdens. Living in public housing during the pandemic, bleach went from $3.99 to $7.99 a gallon. The amount of money that I had to spend and travel outside of the neighborhood, because most of these areas are food deserts. They have very limited health care. Transportation is an issue. In most areas, Red Hook, it became a benefit because we like our little hometown feeling over there. So don't send no big transportation out there right now. But for the most part, the burden was not only for me to protect myself and buy masks and buy sanitizer, but for the neighbors too, because when you're living in a multiple dwelling, it's not just about me on the first floor. I have to get through the common areas. I have to deal with people on a regular basis. So you have to spread your cost burden across a community that's already lacking. So I was very upset when ERAP was not offered to public housing residents. They are the most vulnerable. And how do you just write it off that because I only paid 30% of my income, a 2-year interruption with a pandemic? Public housing had a track record of paying over 91% on-time rent up until the pandemic. Now, if that changed, that was because of the pandemic and the loss of work. Don't use that as a study because for the most part, public housing residents want to maintain and stay in their homes. And those are homes to them. Even if they're raggedy, it's still our homes.
For what it's worth, we have legislation that is intended to change that fact which we're trying to pass by June 2nd. So
good, thank you.
Hopefully get that done.
Hi, my name is Nathan Rich. I'm an architect that does some work with NYCHA. Ms. Blondell, I'm interested, I think you said something about RAD being maybe appropriate for some developments and not for others. I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about that.
Sure. So one of the things with RAD is the way I saw it rolled out initially. It was pretty much like Hope 6. I saw whole developments being encapsulated with these retrofits and upgrades, which meant most residents should not have been on the property. The other thing was on some of the smaller RADs, they were saying, oh, the tenant could go sit in the community room for 8 hours. That doesn't sit well with me knowing the rules and regulations around asbestos, mold, lead. You just can't do work and send the people upstairs overnight and then come back and do more work tomorrow. All of that was kind of figured out in the federal level, but it didn't equate to what I saw on the ground. I saw that RAD did better jobs with the turnkey properties, the smaller ones, 200 units. But a place like Red Hook or Ingersoll, no way. With the Preservation Trust, we have in the language that you can only move them out line by line. So you take care of the lines that have the shared chase wall or plumbing. And an example is Red Hook, which has the 6-story. That would mean moving out 12 units. We can accommodate that on site. and then get the people back in within 2 to 3 months. RAD was taking way longer, and we didn't really take a look back. I remember somebody said something about Baychester. Baychester was way over the average cost. And of course, when you do things new, you want to really do your best job. But they said after $183,000 a unit, it wasn't even worth you saving a unit. They went past that cost for Baychester in what I read. So those were the reasons why I didn't like RAD. There has been some changes, but now that part is up to you and I. It talks about you speaking to the residents. Don't stop with the tenant leader either, and I'm a tenant leader. But don't stop with them. That's one person in a development. You really have to do your work and talk to the residents. So we implied that you now have to vote for these things because they weren't talking to the residents. So we're moving and we're pushing things into the direction to bring the equity to the residents. And that's why I started the Public Housing Civic Association.
So I can't think of a better place to leave it. And I would just add that what you just encouraged this room of folks to do, you were applying specifically to public housing residents, but I would ask the room to broaden that and make sure that we're talking to the residents regardless of where we're building, yes, regardless of who we're building for, whether it's an income tier, a particular population that has special needs, or in a little pocket of a neighborhood. I think talking to the residents, if you remember nothing else at the end of the day, is really key. Yeah. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. It is really a great pleasure to have Alika Ampry-Samuel with us here. She's really become an old friend of our organization, AI New York. When she was a councilwoman, we really fought together to get a gas ban bill, because we all had our reasons for sustainability, safety, and come on, let's just stop installing more fossil fuels in our buildings. Alika was an incredible partner there, and she fought for it. Now she's our Region 2 HUD administrator, appointed by President Biden, and we're so excited to have her here to let us know what HUD is up to. Thank you, Alika.
Thank you. What time is it? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is such a friendly room. I walked in and had to smile because I bumped into people that I've worked with for the past 20 years, and I would have never imagined during that time that I would be in this position and you would be in your position, right? And so it's a warm feeling. And also to hear the previous panel, Karen is just amazing, everyone, right? Amazing. And it is always a good feeling to see NYCHA residents speaking out and being the true leaders and the voice that we need, because I'm born and raised in public housing. I'm a NYCHA baby. And for so many years, the voices of residents were not heard at all, just always silenced. And so thank you, Karen, for all that you do, and thank you for that amazing panel just now. So I'm Alika Ampry-Samuel, the HUD Regional Administrator for New York and New Jersey, and it is an honor to be here right now. And I do want to thank Benjamin for the invitation, because the conversation that we're having around housing crisis is not just important, but it's great to join so many leaders and stakeholders to assess available resources, but to discuss solutions and best practices to tackle homelessness and the housing crisis that we have today and just moving forward. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated our already existing housing problems in New York. And we are just starting to experience the aftermath of COVID lockdowns. And I hope this conference helps us navigate the current housing crisis and guides us towards taking meaningful steps to improve access to housing for all and for all New Yorkers, but with a special and intentional focus on our most vulnerable. I was appointed by President Biden to serve as the regional administrator in January, but I think back to the work I was doing in my previous role with the New York City Council, where I chaired the Public Housing Committee for 4 years. I represented a district in Brownsville, Brooklyn, that is home to the highest concentration of public housing in North America. But I also had a high number of multifamily housing units with Section 8 vouchers. I had the most vacant lots that after a while were finally RFP'd for new construction development. I had a high number of hotels that were built with the sole purpose of being temporary shelters, not thinking about permanent housing at all. And I also had thousands of HUD 202 developments for our seniors and even single family homes. And I also had public housing NYCHA single family homes known as those zombie homes that were left vacant. My community was abandoned for decades, but we were ripe for development and ripe for opportunities. But opportunities should be thoughtful and should be creative. I found myself speaking to folks like Benjamin about how do we build housing that's not only affordable, but is also good for our environment. And it also looks good. And how do you build new construction, but also ensure that it's appropriate for the surrounding communities? So being thoughtful in housing and community development is what we're all about at HUD. And that's why I love my job at HUD. I get a chance to continue in the housing world of building and preserving affordable housing, but also working with thought leaders, community-based organizations, and housing organizations around urban development. COVID showed us that we can't do business as usual. We need to be innovative. We need to be creative. And we need to make sure that we are partnering with like minds. So at HUD, that's what we're doing. In simple terms, HUD's role is to provide federal funding to state, county, and city governments and nonprofits and homeless service providers so that they can administer funding using HUD statutory programs based on our mission. And I think it's important to state what our mission is at HUD in order to provide context to my contribution to this housing crisis conversation. HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality affordable homes for all. HUD is working to strengthen the housing market to bolster the economy and protect consumers, meet the need for quality affordable rental homes, utilize housing as a platform for improving quality of life, build inclusive and sustainable communities free from discrimination, and transform the way HUD does business. And I want to emphasize that part. Transform the way HUD does business. HUD was on the front lines during the COVID crisis, providing disaster funding. In addition to yearly allocations and competitive grants, HUD is responsible for dispersing tens of billions of dollars in emergency funding for communities impacted by disasters. And the COVID pandemic was no different. The CARES Act provided $1.25 billion in COVID-19 disaster relief funding right here in New York. This funding was awarded to state and local governments to provide immediate relief for families and individuals, and the funding was also distributed to local nonprofits and homeless service providers. And there were two other major allocations that you should be aware of, awarded during the pandemic, available to households at risk of homelessness and to housing developers. Last year, HUD announced $5 billion in the American Rescue Plan Home Investment Partnerships Program, and the funds allocated to help communities create affordable housing and services for people experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness, to create affordable housing. And New York received $464.6 million of that funding. HUD also announced $5 billion in funding through the American Rescue Plan for emergency housing vouchers. New York received 9,925 emergency housing vouchers, and they were awarded to 24 authorities right here in New York. So this influx of HUD emergency funding support continues to sustain the available programs and services, and housing service providers had additional resources to help them cope with those during a very difficult time. But under this administration, we are intentional about addressing affordable housing shortages and financing. Secretary Fudge and the Biden administration recognize the uphill battle that families face when it comes to shortage of affordable housing. And it's a daily topic of a conversation across the entire country, not just in Region 2. This is why HUD uses every single tool available to boost the affordable housing supply. To address the critical shortage of quality affordable housing in communities throughout the nation, the fiscal year 23 budget proposes $50 billion in mandatory funding and additional low-income housing tax credits to address the market gaps and increase housing supply. HUD has also taken a series of actions as part of the administration's plan to create, preserve, and sell nearly 100,000 additional affordable homes for homeowners and renters across the country over the next 3 years. And FHA announced last month its first ever vacant property note sale, exclusively for mission-driven nonprofits and units of local government. The sale will take place in June and will include approximately 1,400 mortgage notes secured by vacant properties. That's transforming the way HUD does business. And it's an ongoing theme throughout our agency. In my early remarks, I mentioned briefly about meeting Benjamin in the past life. I like to say past, I don't like to talk about that anymore. Because my old district and so many communities across America bear the brunt of environmental injustices, climate control was a huge focus. Vulnerable New Yorkers are living in communities where they have the highest levels of respiratory diseases because of poor air quality. Families in certain communities are subjected to flooding because of poor infrastructure. We are experiencing floods and fires and natural disasters at levels we've never seen before. And climate change and sustainable design and construction are at the top of your minds here as architects, right? But at HUD, we're also taking this very seriously, and we've provided significant steps to increase resiliency, especially after disasters. Our region has had its share of disasters with Hurricane Irene, Superstorm Sandy, and Ida. They all severely affected our area, leaving hundreds of renters and homeowners with damaged homes. HUD's Climate Action Plan, released last year, focuses on climate adaptation and resilience, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and environmental justice. And I just want to give you a quick highlight of the plan. Cities and localities are on the front lines of the climate emergency, and low-income residents and people of color often bear the brunt of impact when it comes to climate disasters. So in partnership with local leaders, HUD launched a suite of resources, support, and tools to help cities respond equitably to climate crisis. We have a climate resilient toolkit, implementation models, peer-to-peer learning opportunities, stakeholder engagement with underserved communities, and direct support to a cohort of climate cities. So if you're a nerd like me and you like to just go on the web and do, research, feel free to browse the HUD website. Our Community Planning and Development's new website called Supporting Local Climate Action will provide you with information about all the different toolkits. Along with the flexible block grant funding that local governments already receive, this concerted effort will help cities focus climate action on the needs of the most vulnerable and further climate justice. Again, this is transforming the way that HUD does business. And most recently, HUD published new guidance for grantees, seeking to advance equitable distribution of federal funding, targeting assistance to residents of historically marginalized, underserved communities. I don't know how many times I can say that, But the focus right now is making sure that we are connecting with folks that are working with our most vulnerable. That is key to this administration and key to our secretary. Too often, low-income households and communities of color are treated as an afterthought when it comes to advancing technology and green building. HUD will align building and substantial rehabilitation incentives and requirements with energy efficiency and equitable decarbonization goals, including the requirement of new construction with new funds to achieve green building standards. And I remember the press conference that I did with Ben and AIA last year, and it was to highlight new construction and development to go all green. And for so long, we heard that this can't be done with affordable housing deals because of the costs. But when we are all intentionally focused on this work and having conversations about our housing crisis and how we can do better and make things happen, that's when you see real change. So at HUD, we're doing our part, and we're also strengthening our partnerships with the Department of Labor, Department of Energy, AmeriCorps, unions, to ensure that even green jobs programs in our communities are being fully funded and resourced. And we're devoted to that, to make sure that we have green workforce development training opportunities. So we're committed. We're committed to improving the efficiency of public and assisted housing to lower carbon emissions and allow more funds to be spent on the provision of housing instead of on utilities. And while we are also creating job opportunities to build community. So with equity, that's everyone's talking about equity right now, every agency, and it's a focus of this administration. Equity in housing is crucial. And that's why in April, HUD released the Equity Action Plan, advancing racial equity in the work that we do across all platforms. It's the foundation of our strategic plan and informing everything that we do. HUD's mission is critical to achieving the President's vision to build a better America, one where we are ensuring that every person has a shot to get ahead, addressing long-standing systemic challenges, including racial injustice and rising inequality. So just to give you some quick highlights from the budget proposals, HUD is looking to increase by $35 billion for the Housing Supply Fund, a new mandatory program providing grants to state and local housing finance agencies and their partners to invest in strategies to increase the supply of affordable housing. That's $35 billion for the Housing Supply Fund. We're asking for $15 billion to fully fund renewals and amendments in the project-based rental assistance. $100 million for the housing for elderly in our Section 202 program. Another $80 million for housing for persons with disability in our Section 811 program. That will put online 900 new units here. $2 billion for the Home Investment Partnerships program, which has long served as an anchor of the nation's affordable housing system. And also in the budget, we're looking at $1.1 billion in targeted climate resilience and energy efficiency improvements for public housing. $250 million to help communities develop and implement locally driven comprehensive neighborhood plans to transform underserved communities. And the last big piece, supporting the permanently authorizing of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. The authorization would improve the transparency and predictability of CDBG-DR funds for impacted communities. Again, we are living in unpredictable times, but we can predict that a disaster will happen again. So while we are rocked and shocked by devastation, HUD is transforming the way we do business. So in conclusion, we all have common goals to end homelessness, to preserve affordable housing and create climate resistant and sustainable housing and inclusive communities. HUD is here to partner with you and help you achieve your goals. This administration has thought things through, and it has a climate plan in place. We've put forth equity guidelines. We've eliminated the barriers to home ownership through FHA. And so I really hope that the information that I provided you today will serve as a tool in order for you to look at the way you're doing business and know that we can do this together on behalf of the people that we serve. And so I thank you for having me here today. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or would like to partner with us, because we're here. Again, we're transforming the way we do business at HUD. Thank you so much.
Alika and Samuel, thank you so much for all you do, all you've done for New York, all you're continuing to do in the federal level, and we're so glad to have you as a friend and a representative. Thank you. So, great pleasure to now bring on the last panel, which is going to be moderated by Mark Norman. Mark Norman, who has worn several hats in many institutions, all very prominent, but most recently now named the Dean at NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate. So we were thrilled to have him here back in New York. And I will let Mark introduce his panel on the future. Thank you, Mark.
Hi, everybody. The last panel. So it's tough to make predictions about the future. I guess there's a Yogi Berra quote that's something like, we can't sort of make that, but Ben has charged me with bringing up a panel to think about the future of housing and how maybe we get out of this crisis. I was looking back, actually, when I moved to New York in 1995, actually to work for CDFI, LISC, and looking at the fact that the in-rem housing stock at that time in HPD was 51,000, almost 52,000 units, almost 5,500 buildings, and thinking about how all that's gone now. And it was CDFIs, it was public-private partnerships, it was nonprofit and private developers that did that. So I think we can confront and solve crises. I think there's reason to be hopeful about some of the things that we've done in New York in the past. It was also sort of a model of HPD, HDC, HCR working together along with the public and the private sector. And it really became a national model. And in the mid-2000s, right, the preservation of expiring Mitchell-Lama, large-scale projects like Starrett City, and then what we're thinking about today in terms of supportive housing, New York 3, and also what we've heard today about sort of some of the things going on at NYCHA and new leadership at HUD, I think gives us reason for hope. At the same time, we've done a lot, but we haven't solved the problem. So in many ways, as we heard in our first panel, conditions are arguably worse. And that's sad given that multiple administrations have devoted substantial resources to housing and have preserved and created hundreds of thousands of new units. So in our current time, the pandemic has actually given us the ability to experiment and evaluate things we used to just talk about: eviction moratorium, income supports, rapid housing solutions. We now have seen what those things are. And so that'll be some of the things that I ask our panel. In addition to the projects and proposals that they'll present, some of the questions are, what did we learn? And what do we keep? And how do we maybe codify some of the things that we saw into practice and into policy? And I can't think of a better panel to tackle these questions. And joining me today will be my new borough president, Antonio Reynoso, the borough president of Brooklyn, previously New York City Council member for Brooklyn's 34th Council District, which covers Bushwick, Ridgewood, and Williamsburg. He's also spent his career advocating for stronger tenants' rights and anti-eviction laws. He's also a staunch advocate for fair and equitable urban planning. And then each presenter will present for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come up and have a panel. The borough president will go first, followed by Lisa Gomez, Chief Executive Officer and partner at L&M Development. L&M, prolific developer of affordable and mixed income housing, with also divisions in construction and property management. So I think we have a wide breadth of experience, both in the public, private, and nonprofit sector. Our other speaker is Muzzy Rosenblatt, CEO of Bowery Residents Committee, BRC, a nonprofit offering housing services to create pathways from homelessness to home. And prior to BRC, he served in 3 New York City mayoral administrations and in the Department of Homeless Services. So I think we have a really sort of wide breadth of speakers, and they'll go for 5 minutes before our panel discussion. So I might invite all of them up to talk now. And we're going to start with you, Mr. Borough President. And I'm going to let them decide whether they want the podium or the seats.
I'm going to do the podium. Perfect. Let me just make sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do the best I can to keep this as short as possible because I actually want to get into the discussion. I think discussions tend to be more valuable than lectures to me when I was learning. So I'm going to try to push that here. But I am Antonio Reynoso. I'm the new Brooklyn Borough President, and very happy and fortunate to have this position that I never thought in my lifetime I would ever have. So I'm having a good time. Trying to bring back a little of that Marty Markowitz flavor to it. I would start by saying, I'm happy to be in arguably the second best borough in the city of New York at this moment, and hope that Mark Levine gave me my passport to allow me to come over the bridge every once in a while. But we're talking about something that is very serious, and that it is something that we should be addressing in a very serious way, and it is the housing crisis that we have. When I was a council member, I wrote an op-ed and a white paper alongside Council Member Brad Lander, who is now the comptroller, where we talked about the YIMBY-NIMBY death loop. And it's developer proposed plans and then a community that stands up against the proposed plans out of fear of gentrification and the changes that they're about to see or could see in their communities. And it's a never-ending cycle that always ends most of the time with a last-minute deal put together, the last 5 minutes of the vote of a city council member negotiated with the developer and DCP or the mayor's office. That system in itself, I think, is one that can work for developers considering the elected officials of the past. But now what we're seeing is a significant amount of elected officials that don't take money from real estate and don't feel an obligation to have to move forward with development at all costs, or that development is the foundation by which the city runs. So now that real estate is having that trouble, I think that they're going to start moving towards assisting us in building out a new process that is not ULURP, that allows for community engagement at a much earlier point in the conversation, so that when they get to the end, they're not doing this dance and these last-minute negotiations. Instead, they have something more concrete. And what I've done, and what I'm doing now, is working alongside Hester Street and the Regional Planning Association, RPA, is doing something called comprehensive planning, which is not foreign to anywhere else in the entire world, even in this country, but is absolutely foreign to here, the city of New York. The Department of City Planning, by all intents and purposes, when they do a rezoning, is it an admission of wrongdoing or an admission of a flawed process, right? There's a plan in the city of New York, and it is the entire zoning system and zoning structure that exists. Every time somebody comes for a rezoning, is that they're saying that the zoning plan put forth by the city of New York is insufficient in some way, shape, or form, and that they're going to amend that plan. So in amending it, they're telling DCP that they've done a job that doesn't speak to what the future of the city should look like. What I want to do is that instead of allowing for it to be a single momentary, block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood plan, that we do a whole citywide plan, that the entire city goes through an entire planning process, including the community, in dictating and having some level of self-determination about what the city is going to look like over the next 10 years. In doing so, we hold everyone accountable. Not only the poor black and brown neighborhoods, in which we've built almost all the affordable housing in the city of New York over the last decade, Now we're going to talk to, and I'm going to talk about Brooklyn, Sheepshead Bay. We're going to talk to Midwood. We're going to talk to Coney Island. We're going to talk to Bay Ridge. We're going to talk to Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope. You have to be a part of the solution as well. It cannot be these same neighborhoods. We're going to talk to single-family homeowners and tell them we're going to add value to your property by making it so that you can never build another single-family home in the city of New York, especially in the context and the crisis that we're dealing with now. But everyone's going to be a part of it. Everyone, which means that these black and brown communities that are mostly poor are no longer going to fight saying that the burden of getting us out of this hole falls exclusively on us. They're going to know that there are other people that are going to be a part of this bigger picture, this grander plan, and that they're not building it all alone, that other neighborhoods that are affluent and white are also going to be a part of that conversation. And when we do that, we task every single neighborhood with a certain amount of housing, their responsibility. At the bottom part, right? Sheepshead Bay, you got 10,000 units in the next 10 years. You tell us where you want to put it, but it's going to go in your neighborhood. And if you don't tell us where you want to put it, we're going to use data sets and dictate those outcomes for you, because you need to do it, because it is necessary. And guess what? There are no homeless shelters in your district. That is also something you're going to take on. And by the way, we see that you don't have enough parks, so we're going to figure out a way to do that as well. There's a school shortage in this district. We don't want to build 20,000 units without considering another school in your district. We're going to do it comprehensively, so it all makes sense. That is how we should be building our city, especially the greatest city in the entire world. But it isn't. Right now, the system we have in place is shoddy and is not comprehensive, and it is intentional. And in the past, it was intentional to allow for a significant amount of housing development to happen at the behest and at the will of developers. But now, with the elected officials that we have now, that is no longer going to be the case. So we should think about switching the way we do work, because we need to build, and building is important, and we cannot not build. And also, we haven't seen a significant amount of housing development in this city over the last decade. And the only time we've seen less development was during the Great Depression. And that is not going to work in this city. So we have to think differently. And I'm hoping that my comprehensive plan will be a foundation and a model so we could use citywide in an effort to build more housing and do it the right way comprehensively. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak. You should be sitting here.
Yeah. You there? Yeah, we shift down one.
What am I doing this
We're
way?
all-
We're in the wrong spot?
Choreography was
Sorry.
part of the agenda
This way?
today. No, you're that
Oh,
way.
this way,
Well,
okay.
and you're up there.
This is
All
what
right.
happens when you don't
There
comprehend
we
the
go.
plan.
There we go.
I don't know. I
Thank
feel
you,
like
Lily.
I'm at a disadvantage. Hi, my name is Lisa Gomez. I'm the CEO of L&M Development Partners. We're a 40-year-old affordable housing development, construction, and property management firm. We currently manage about 20,000 units. Most of those in New York City, and most of those affordable. And I would like to, I know we're in the future, and I know I'm supposed to be Mariana Rivera, but I want to, sort of just give a little bit of context, sort of riff on what the borough president and the HUD administrator were saying. We've been through unprecedented times. Our residents are struggling. The resources haven't been sufficient. No affordable housing landlord that I know of wants to go to court, but those systems are broken. It's going to be tough to dig out of this hole, and it's going to take years. And with insurance rates increasing double digit every year, with gas right now is, even though we're big into building net zero, and we encourage everybody to do it, but the fact remains is that there are a lot of buildings that are fossil fuel related, and they're really stretched right now. So that's the backdrop. I think for us, we like to work on projects where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, where you can have a school, or you can have the National Urban League's civil rights experience, or you can have the Universal Hip Hop Museum coexisting with affordable housing. A lot of things have to come together for those projects, and I think the economics are a real challenge. On a regular piece of free land from the city, it costs $150,000 in capital subsidy to build one affordable housing unit. To keep the lights on, not even including taxes or a mortgage, it costs $700 a month to operate a regular old vanilla housing unit. So when we talk about trying to reach down to lower affordability, to get a broader spectrum of people in buildings. I think there really needs to be support at the federal, state, and city levels for ongoing operating subsidy. I think some of the work that's happened during the pandemic could be a roadmap to for us to go forward. I think that some of the things that are real challenges is the tension between a historic district and density. I mean, I think everyone's pretty familiar with the Soho rezoning and the Elizabeth Street Gardens saga, and I think that's really sort of a little bit of a microcosm of sort of forces that want to maintain neighborhood character, that want to maintain historic districts, that don't want the density. But if you actually think about the amount of housing that we need, and you think about the urgency of it, there needs to be a lot more density in a lot more places, and maybe the borough president's plan will get it done. I hope so. It just feels like the political environment is so fractured. But I think if you think about our everyone's favorite boogeyman, Robert Moses built something like 30,000 units over a period of time in the absolute most wrong way that I think anybody in this room would think it could be done. We need more than that. So I don't have all the answers, but I think I would like to work in partnership with my colleagues here in trying to address a plan that keeps New York a place where a lot of people can live. But I do think we have to realize that we're probably not going to solve it all within the borders of our city, and we have to sort of work also collegially with our surrounding neighborhoods. So that's my 2 cents.
Lighting up there. I don't want to see any secrets. Hi. Muzzy Rosenblatt of BRC, a real honor to be here. For this panel, I was saying to Ben, I was disappointed it wasn't going to be at LaGuardia Place. I remember that place fondly, eager to go back, but I have to say, being here at what is now the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, did I get that right? I remember it as a native New Yorker as the Mid-Manhattan Library. Others, yes, right? Did a lot of high school term papers here and a lot of other stuff here. But in any event, the place looks great. And it really reminds me of a great book that I think speaks to what we're talking about in a larger contextual community basis, Palaces for the People by Eric Kleinberg, that speaks to the power that libraries play in building community, not just in building knowledge. And I do want to note, since I'm on a historical riff here, that the borough president's ambitious vision is possible because it's been done. It's been about 50 years since we've had a plan for the city of New York, but we can do it. So it is aspirational, but it's also realistic because we've done it. The panels today have been great. The speakers have been great. Ours is the best, of course. But, there was a point made. We're here kind of looking at the future, as Mark said, and Ingrid was talking earlier about subsidies being part of the solution, that we need more subsidy, right? So just data, I'm a big data person. We have a subsidy in this country, Section 8. It isn't the best, maybe, but it is something, and a lot of people benefit from it. And 1 in 4 Americans, 1 in 4 New Yorkers who are eligible for it get it. So if we just funded the thing that we created, we'd have a subsidy. But we don't, and I'm not suggesting I've got the magic potion to change how Congress operates, and you know how that's going. So what we've done at BRC, we're a full continuum. Our mission is helping people reclaim lives, offering hope and opportunity, providing opportunities for health and self-sufficiency. We work mostly with people experiencing homelessness, starting on the streets and the subways, engaging, motivating, not enforcing. That's not what we do. We're talking to people, building trust, building relationships, and helping people find a path from homelessness to home. Shelters are a part of that solution, as is housing, as is treatment, as is employment, as is knowledge, and all those things. And so we don't need as many shelters as we have, but we need them. They're places for people to heal. We don't want people to be sick. We would never think of getting rid of hospitals. as we were doing our work, what we were seeing was that people were coming in, staying in, getting better, moving on. But they were coming back at more rapid rates than they had been for a while. It was taking longer to find housing. It was taking longer to leave shelter to find housing. Fewer people were moving, and those who moved were coming back at a higher rate. So we began to break that data down and say, why was that happening? You know, maybe we screwed up. Maybe we didn't prepare people well. What we saw was that people couldn't afford the housing they were finding. They were having jobs, keeping jobs, stability in their lives, but the rents were too damn high, and there wasn't enough subsidy. So we began to figure out how can we tackle that issue. And before I ever ask anybody for more money, I look at the money we spend and I say, are we doing everything we can with the money we have? Our biggest expense is our workforce, God bless them, the healers who do the work that changes lives and helps people achieve that potential. But our second biggest expense as BRC, as a nonprofit organization, is rent. You know, we don't have an endowment. You know, we're not a hospital or a university. We rent the buildings we do our work in. So what does that mean? That's like 20% of our budget, right? So that's like over $20 million a year. Well, what is rent? Rent is I'm giving a landlord money so that they acquire an asset. They can pay off their debt, their mortgage, and I'm giving them a profit for the privilege of being able to do that. And I mean, that's how the system works. They wouldn't do it if that wasn't in it. So I said, all right, well, maybe we need to think about how do we move to be renters to owners? And we had that conversation in the city and said, you know, that's not a bad idea. If we build the asset capacity of the nonprofits, right, then they've got greater stability. That's a good thing. They said, but you know, you're a nonprofit. You don't need to keep the profit. So it's good to enrich the for-profit landlord, but for us, you don't want us to have it. They say, all right, what will you do with it? I said, well, you know, if you give us a 30-year contract for a 30-year mortgage so we can finance the construction of a shelter, I'll take the same profit. I'll even take a haircut. I'm still doing it. And commit it to a 30-year rental subsidy. And so that's what we did. We built a building on Landing Road in the Bronx, a site where a private developer might have built just a shelter, made money, fine. We built a shelter and housing. The shelter rent is slightly less than what the market would otherwise be, and yet we still generate enough surplus income after we pay off our mortgage to subsidize 130 units of housing without Section 8, with studios that rent for people who are moving out of our shelters, making $20,000 a year, right? So at that 30%, $20,000, $6,000, $500 a month. Our studios rent for $477 a month, and you don't need any more subsidy than that. The rent that, now when you think about the size of the shelter system, right? So we had a 200-bed shelter is basically subsidizing 100 units of housing for extremely low-income individuals, making it affordable to people who are making minimum wage to have rent that they can afford. We have 60,000, well, maybe now 50,000 shelter beds in New York City. Let's just say we took 20% of those that are being rented from private landlords and instead took that existing, I'm not talking about more shelter, I'm saying taking the money we're spending now, build a new shelter, and by the way, the shelter is gorgeous. It is built with dignity, purpose-built, and it was recognized by AIA as a beautiful model. It won the Andrew J. Thomas Award for Housing. Thank you very much for acknowledging and supporting that, and then making our lead architect, Andrew Knox, ESKW, a member of the College of Fellows of AIA. We can design with dignity for the same amount of money. We can build with dignity for the same amount of money. We can build places where people can heal and then use that same money. What we're spending right now that's going out the window, we could recapture. So if we took 10,000 units out of the shelter system and just repurpose them this way with the money we already spent, we could subsidize 5,000 units of housing. It won't go all the way to solve the problem. It is a strategy, not the strategy. But there are things we can do now with the money we spend now that can truly change lives and begin to move the needle in the right direction. So that's our contribution today. Thank you.
So I sense a little bit of hope. I think I heard some hope in this.
And Muzzy, you touched a little bit on kind of what if Section 8 was universal, which I think is a great, yes, may we all have that one day in our lives. But when you talk to people with Section 8 vouchers, one of the biggest issues is actually getting a landlord to accept that voucher. So I'm going to wave my wand, we have universal Section 8, and then we have a whole bunch of people looking for housing, and they're not going to be able to get it in places that Mr. Borough President, you talked about, like Sheepshead Bay and Brooklyn Heights. And I'm wondering if we have ways, and maybe we should also bring in our HUD friends, to think about if we got some of the things we wanted, how do we then sort of activate them so that they become sort of useful in all of the neighborhoods we want them to be useful in?
Well, all right. I think that one is funding Section 8 at the level at which it needs to be able to afford those neighborhoods, which I know is a big priority now of the Biden administration. Two, I think that making the process easier and more transparent for both residents and landlords is another. Right now, the city has a homeless subsidy called FEPS. It takes 2 months after a file is approved for affordability to get that subsidy flowing. That's 2 months that a family has to potentially stay in a shelter, stay doubled up, stay in a domestic violence situation. That's crazy. Like, let's figure out, put our heads together. There's a lot of smart people in this city, how we can make things easier, not harder. And somebody said to me this week, you know, it takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money to be poor, between, you know, just lots and lots of regulation. You know, and I guess we're protecting against fraud, but what could we do to make everyone's lives easier? I mean, we're a landlord that takes Section 8, that takes vouchers, that compose a lot of our portfolio, and it's a lot of work. I mean, we have a whole team of people who are working on that, and I could imagine if somebody didn't do this for their main body of work, that they wouldn't want to be bothered by it. Like, we make plenty of other things easy for people. You can pay your taxes pretty easily. You can swipe your Metro card pretty easily. But, you know, you have to, like, bring papers and go to things and fill it out. And so, like, what can we do in a technologically sophisticated society to make it easier for all involved?
I think a big issue is just discrimination. I think is the number one issue. Is landlords just don't take it. They assume that people that are holding Section 8 vouchers are tenants that they wouldn't want, or are not going to be tenants that are going to follow through on their commitment to pay the subsidized version, or they come with baggage of being formerly homeless, might not have a job, might be some inconsistencies. We know that some folks are in need of a lot of help outside of just a housing crisis. Usually if they're in the shelter, there's other crises that came before it. And because of that, landlords don't want to give houses to Section 8 tenants. I think the one thing, or Section 8 voucher holders, by the way, I grew up in Section 8, and it saved my life. It saved my entire family, but it was a Section 8 based, HUD-based Section 8, which means that it came with the apartment. We didn't go in with a voucher. I think if there is a process by which the landlord does not know whether or not you have a voucher till the absolute end, it would solve a lot of problems. If we can go in and not show the landlord, just assume we can pay 3 months of rent, we can pay security, whatever you want, we're good to go. And then when you sign on the dotted line and you have your apartment, it's time to make your pay. Then you present your Section 8 voucher and say that you're going to be receiving this funding from the federal government and so forth. Everyone would get housing, everyone. But it's straight up discrimination. And we're seeing countless cases at the federal level, at the city level, and at the state level when we do these investigations and have people walk in with Section 8 vouchers versus people that don't walk in with Section 8 vouchers and go for the same apartment, and it is almost exclusively given to the person that doesn't have a voucher. So the only way to deal with that is, again, make it so that people don't know you have it until the end, or make it illegal to ask for it until the end, something where the landlords are not aware that you're a Section 8 voucher holder, I think will make a big difference. And just LLM is an exception. I want to be very clear. Most of what LLM is going to say today is going to be the exception. They are one of the largest developers of affordable housing in the city of New York. They are doing it the right way for the most part. But
I'll take it.
I just don't want they're not a traditional developer or a traditional landlord. They understand the affordable housing model in a very great way, and have known how to make housing affordable and make a lot of it in the city of New York. But they have Section 8 tenants. They'll take a voucher without discriminating very easily, but that's not the standard. That's more that's more the exception.
I think for smaller landlords, they don't know, I know it's outright, maybe it's outright discrimination, but it's just, there's a lot of administration, and if you're a small landlord, you're probably like, oh. So.
That's true.
I'll just say that the Mets and Yankees are both winning for the most part, and I'm very happy with that. But on the, and then the nonprofits are taking Section 8. But I think one of the things that we miss is that if there's enough Section 8 out there, right? When you built these projects, you built them with the intent to be a Section 8
No, not
landlord?
necessarily. No,
All
so,
right.
I mean some, but
you build it into the financing of the project that you're going to build a certain number of units.
not the vouchers. Not the vouchers. The
Okay.
vouchers are just regular folks
right.
who are
That's-
coming in.
that's
They're
even
coming in
better.
through the lottery. They're coming in however they're coming in, and the administration of it's a lift.
Right,
It does,
and
I
you
think
have
it could
units
be.
that sit empty. Not only are the families waiting longer in shelter,
Yeah,
but the
2
units
months
are sitting
from
empty,
the time
not
a
generating
file
income.
is approved till the subsidy starts flowing. That's not necessary in the world today. I don't think.
I like the counterpoint, no argument.
Unless he's sitting in the
I'm
middle.
trying to,
But
for
when we're
the
talking
most-
about like the subsidies, the housing subsidies that we're talking about, it's hard to know. Nobody opens the books to like elected officials. So you're kind of negotiating against yourself. You're in the dark, right? So if a developer comes and says, hey, I can build 200 units of housing, but only 25% of that could be affordable because the finances won't work. You're just gonna have to take their word on it. You have no idea whether that's true or not. You don't know if they're gonna leave that project making $20 million in profit or $2 million in profit. So a council member is negotiating in the dark. So when we talk about these finances, it's like, it's absolutely true. The bank won't lend unless there's a certain level of like profit that they assume or a commitment to paying down the debt in a reasonable way. But we don't know what that is. We never know what that is. Only time that we get to figure out what it is when you get into a contract with the city related to subsidies, and the city asks for those numbers so the finances could work. So in this affordable housing, this idea that apartments cost a certain amount of money and the finances have to work and we won't be able to do it. In the 1990s and the 2000s, we built almost exclusively, affordable housing was built exclusively by not-for-profit developers, almost exclusively, and it was perfectly fine model that wasn't necessarily having too much trouble. There were some opportunities or some moments when HPD had to step in and give some subsidy or some loans for rehabilitation and so forth. And then Bloomberg comes in and says the only way we can build is public-private partnership, and completely changed the model. And now we're hearing about this unsustainable financing in these models that we never heard of when we were dealing with the not-for-profits outside of when they needed to renew their regulatory agreement with HPD and needed the money. But then the not-for-profit developers are saying it's impossible to build 100% affordable housing when that's all we did back in the day with not-for-profits exclusively.
What's changed is the availability of free land. We worked through a lot of that supply in the 70s, 80s, and maybe starting with Koch. There was so much free land. I mean, there was the city had that as a tremendous resource to sort of deploy for affordable housing. And truthfully, I don't think the whole apparatus started to focus on density in that plan early enough. We were building,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Low-rise townhouse type things, which were great, but it was short-sighted because we can't redo that now. And I think not-for-profits, even for-profits, just were able to go in there and build so much more. But when land is starting at $80 a foot in central Brooklyn or maybe the Bronx versus $500 a foot in Manhattan, like the numbers are tough.
But that's what earlier speaker, I don't remember who, there were so many great ones, but we don't have city land, but we do have city real estate. We have schools. People talked about libraries. Somebody talked about the example. And we even have shelters. I have a shelter on Lexington between Franklin and Classen. It's an old 2-story building that the city owns that we operate. with a vacant lot next door, that the density we could build, we could tear that shelter down, rebuild shelter and housing on the same site. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at city properties, police stations, firehouses, all that, build over them, take them down, and build new and modern, where we can kind of take that land idea and it's a little bit more complicated. There are a lot more issues, but it's there, and let's maximize it. We can't go out, so we're going to have to go up.
Yeah, and also like speculation is something also we have to reconsider. There are people buying manufacturing land that on average for its purpose goes for $26 a square foot if you're lucky. And people will buy it at $100, $200 a square foot in thinking that they're going to rezone it to residential and be able to make money. And the city bails them out every single time. The city accepts the speculation as a cost of doing business.
And
It's
you're
like
saying the bailout is the rezoning.
the rezoning, exactly. And the rezoning and then demanding very little of it, right? If you're doing an R to M, M to R conversion of manufacturing to residential, you should be able to build 50% affordable housing at minimum, deeply affordable, because of the price of the land is very affordable, or it's cheap. But because they buy it speculating for the rezoning and the conversion, the owner of the manufacturing building, which wouldn't get more than $26 a square foot, is like, yeah, I want to sell it for $250 a square foot. And they buy it. And then the city says, thank you for buying it. You want to rezone it. We want you to rezone it. But we get it. You can only do MIH and an M to R conversion. And it's just like, and they accept that. And they subsidize these over-speculated properties as well. So it's just like in the private industry, being very careful, not being very careful, like I'm not a developer, so they could do what they want. But this idea that because of their speculation, their finances become tougher, and we have to eat that as city, through city and state subsidy is also something that is, I think, a concern and hurts our ability to produce affordable housing.
And so on the issue of industrial land, I'm wondering in some cases if we sort of delayed the pain, right? Because you're talking about, right, sort of middle class, upper middle class neighborhoods that didn't do anything during the 40 to 50 rezonings, right? And in some cases got downzoned.
Yeah.
And now, right, and we went to sort of the path of least resistance, the industrial land, the lower income neighborhoods that, right, didn't have the kind of resources to fight that. And so what are some of the ways you get those communities to buy in? Sometimes it's a carrot, but does it need to be a stick?
I don't believe in manufacturing to residential conversion at all. In my district, when I represented Williamsburg and Bushwick, we had over 17,000 jobs in the manufacturing district, of which I think it was like 67 to 70% of it was walking. They walked to work, which means those are my constituents. And there's 17,000 jobs, and manufacturing jobs on average go about $60,000 minimum for low education, high skilled workers. So I thought protecting was important. We went through COVID, and our supply chain was completely out of whack. We had to wait for China to get their stuff together, to get stuff from Indonesia and so forth, and we had no capacity to do anything in this city to take care of ourselves. And there's some level of self-sustainability that has to exist within the boroughs, within this city, in case another crisis like this happens. And the only way you're gonna do that is through manufacturing work. So this idea that we can build a city that is based almost exclusively on retail, commercial, and residential without any manufacturing is very concerning to me. Also, the manufacturing districts are adjacent mostly to poor neighborhoods because it was inexpensive in the 70s and 80s to live there. You live next to the Domino Sugar Factory in the 1970s, you were probably paying like $200 in rent because nobody wanted to live on Kent Avenue because there was a lot of darkness, is what I'm gonna call it, in those areas. And now the light is shined, and now it's very expensive, but what it did was displace over 20,000 Latinos in 10 years after the rezoning that was done in the waterfront, right? So it's just like there's like impacts to everything we do. And I would argue like find an industrial business zone that's not in a poor neighborhood at this moment, that is not highly subsidized. So we gotta be very careful about trying to build out of this crisis through manufacturing or in the manufacturing areas, because then we're gonna lose another asset that I think is as important and as valuable as residential. So I just think about the spaces we have and building really high, and stop this, for me, stop this height conversation is just, we should be over it. We need height, we need a lot of it, and we need to build taller. We have less space, it's not like kryptonite where you could throw it in the water and we get new land. A lot of people don't get that reference. I think it's Superman 2. We're not gonna build more land. The land we have, we need to build vertically. We need to build high. So we got to be very careful about this idea that we're gonna build housing 6 stories when we should be building housing 20 stories. We really need to start moving away from that. And I'm one of the progressives, trust me. And I think height is the way out. We need to build taller, not out.
Great.
So I should say, I think we have to resolve the sort of the tension between contextual zoning, which are low-rise, often wealthier communities, and the density conversation.
Yeah. So I'm also aware of the time, and the last panels always get sort of squeezed, and I want to make sure that we also have time for audience questions. And I think we do have a microphone, and we do have questions. Oh yeah, if you could tell us who you are.
Yes. Hi, I'm Katie Devlin. I'm an architect, unemployed at the time. And I think the big concern with the density is the super talls and the neighborhoods that are basically decimated by huge sky-blocking residential buildings with no affordability. So I think there's some context to the rezoning issues that come in. I'm in a midtown neighborhood, which is, I don't know, R12. It's not a big deal, but we've got some monster skyscrapers going in at 34th and 3rd, 2 of them right across the street from each other, which is fine. They're not beautiful. There's some really ugly skyscrapers I can see in Brooklyn and in Queens from my building. But I think there's the whole concept of it becomes this soulless Hudson Yards. And I think that's something where contextual comes in as something to be really carefully done, because Hudson Yards is not contextual to anything except itself. So I think there's some neighborhoods where we really have to look at not just height and density, but design, and design done well, as opposed to for people that can afford $1 million a month. So I think that's something that hasn't been addressed and seems to be the dividing point between increased zoning and super talls.
If I could just jump in real quickly on just the density thing, where it's probably not controversial but still can't be done, is sometimes the buildings that are old have been there so long that they're actually overbuilt the current zoning.
Yeah.
And so that if it's actually cheaper to tear down the building and build a new building, but then you have to replace it with something smaller. That just seems dumb, right? At least if you can grandfather in the buildings that's there, you should at least be able to replace something of the same size, and you can't even do that. And that takes a lot of properties off the options too. So I think that's an easy place to get.
And I think there's a lot of room between brownstones and super talls.
Exactly.
I
think so too. I think that's the balance. But the folks in the brownstones think a 3-story building is a super tall. So you got to be careful. You got to be careful, and that's what I'm saying. And I think in the 1980s, when we rezoned, the last time we rezoned Bushwick was I think in like 1960. It was rezoned into like 4-story buildings, and there was a huge fight about them being super tall buildings. And now we're looking to do it and move them to like 10 to 12-story buildings. And now our folks, is all context and perspective. Right now, it feels very uncomfortable. But what this city looked like 30 years ago is a lot different than what it's going to look like in the next 30 years. And we should be preparing for our future. The lack of demand, the lack of supply in the housing market is making the city a city that you're either extremely poor living in a NYC development or extremely rich living anywhere else.
Or living on the subway.
Right. So we don't have a balance. There's no middle class. And I think the only way to get out of that is to build a lot. So the super talls, I'm okay with it, with having that conversation about them being too tall, but I don't want them to be the ground or the basis for the argument to not develop at all, which is often used as a crutch to the anti-development argument.
Right, and I think there's another issue. Nicholas Bloom shared an amazing, distressing graphic about the number of sort of second home, vacant homes, which is paired with the issue of sort of these super luxury buildings, which can have an effect. I think we have another question.
Oh, you got the microphone.
Hi. My name is Matthew Melody. I'm an architect with Curtis and Ginsburg Architects, and I'm proud to have worked for Lisa, and also proud to have Antonio represent my district, Williamsburg. voted for you the very first time you got on the council.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you.
Good job.
You got to say something nice about Muzzy too.
Yeah.
Mark and I went to college together.
Oh, there you go.
Mark Ginsburg of
my boss.
Yeah.
Not me. So on the topic of density, one of the things we need to look at, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is how we deal with the landmark districts. Because yeah, there's the manufacturing, but there's also a lot of these wealthy neighborhoods that have landmarked themselves and basically capped density. So is there any way we can work on that?
I agree that it's an issue. I think that, you know, to the point of the challenge is that the people who are voting on whatever that's happening or voicing what's happening are the people who already live there, people who already are set. It's the people who we want to build housing for who really don't have the voice. So, you know, I think there has to be an acknowledgement that the brownstone districts or any other historic district has got to accept something. You can build contextual stuff. You know, you're not going to build a super tall Park Slope across the road in Atlantic Yards, maybe. But but I think, could you build a 6, 8, 10-story building in Park Slope without it looking crazy? Sure, there's plenty of those. If you look at, I mean, if you think about the 4th Avenue rezoning, also a mistake. That rezoning produced contextual buildings, but people couldn't build enough to make it work, so they're really ugly buildings. You know, the parking, the ground floor is dead. So I think, you know, we've had missteps. Could we do better? Yes, but I think it all has to be with a very, very united focus of building more housing.
Yeah. We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Dale. I'm an architect. I live in a 421A in Queens. My question is for Mr. Borough President. I wasn't familiar with your proposal about allocating a certain quantity of units in each neighborhood, which I think is a great idea. I was wondering if you can expand on that plan, how you would mandate that, and how you would how it would come to be. Are you anticipating that the development need would exist and you're just funneling something that's going to happen to different areas? Or, I mean, if you could just expand on that.
Yeah. So I don't have the power to mandate it. So what our office is doing is right now there's a timeline, a clock when ULURP starts by which I have to approve a project. And I think I get 60 days and it has to go through my office. If you follow through with the guidelines put forth by the comprehensive plan, we'll get you an approval within 5 days. So we're trying to save you, 55 days, which is money, in the work that we're talking about by speeding up that process. And what we would do is we're gonna build out characteristics of neighborhoods. So if your neighborhood is a low density neighborhood and, you know, next to transportation and has this many park space allotted allotment, we want you to build 10,000 units of housing in that type of neighborhood. And if a developer comes and says, I'm willing to do that in this neighborhood, which aligns with character B of the master plan, and we agree, we'll move forward faster with the process. This aligned with this question, I think what you need to really do this is you need like a one-term mayor. You need a mayor that is going to just do the things that no one wants. The medicine giver is the person who's going to do everything. Everybody's going to hate it. Everybody's going to complain. But you do it, and then they're out, and it's done. Including, like, who's going to go against Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope in New York City and think they're going to win an election? They're not going to do that. So Brooklyn Heights is protected forever, so long as their political capital and affluence and their influence is solidified. So my plan is going to be a recommendation. If the mayor likes it, I'm hoping he could emulate it and say, hey, I want to start moving forward with a system that could make this more mandatory, more permanent.
Yeah. Last comments, Lisa, Masi.
We'll give one more question.
Sure.
No?
Yes.
If it's quick.
Okay. Truly the last.
I talk a lot.
Matthew Brimmer from I have a firm here in the city, Architecture Information. We had the pleasure of working with Lisa on Navy Green. I thought for the last question, I'd bring it back to the future, since this is what we're talking about. How can you, each of you, in your various sectors, really push the constant battle between the climate crisis, sustainability, resiliency, and the fact that we have to build for a resilient future, and value and cost and current cost escalations? And it's something that we see every day in our balance sheets.
For sure. I think, how about you go to the head of the line if you're doing a net zero building, if you're doing a passive house, if you're doing more affordable. You know, I think right now both the city and the state's affordable housing financing pipeline is probably 4 or 5, some years long. It's a big backlog. But you know, we just finished we're finishing our second passive house, and we just finished 3 more net zero carbonless buildings in Brooklyn. But the technology is not, I mean, it is a cost. We originally did it because there was a gas moratorium, and we're like, I don't know, let's figure this out. But I think that, you know, it is more expensive to build right now. Hopefully over time, you know, things will commodify and go down in cost. But, you know, giving, you know, both not-for-profit and for-profit developers are, you know, show them the goalposts, they'll figure out how to get there, and show that you're prioritizing climate resilience.
Are there policy possibilities there?
So you know, for a conscientious developer like L&M that's willing to trade some net income in order to create communities and developments that they're proud of and that we can live together and sustain our city, that works. For a nonprofit where so much of what our budget comes from is government money, the actual government that wants the resiliency isn't always willing to put the money in to fund the resiliency. They're, you know, or they're looking to us to, you know, well, go talk to Robin Hood about that, or go talk to a foundation, you know, and then we can't scale that, right? Philanthropy can't scale. They can demonstrate, but they can't scale. The proof of climate doesn't need to be demonstrated anymore. But it speaks to, right, so the borough president's talking about an ambitious citywide strategy. We need a national strategy on housing, and we need a national investment in housing. It was in Build Back Better, but everything was in Build Back Better. And, you know, when I got the stew, I didn't always know what was in it. I'm not sure I wanted to eat it. I think if we break it down and ask for up and down votes on childcare, you for it or against it, affordable housing, you for it or against it, climate, are you for it or against it, I actually think you'd get a lot of stuff. You know, going back to the subsidy, right? If we got enough subsidy, and just to put it in context, we have 2 basic subsidy programs in this country. One is a mortgage interest deduction that you get off your taxes if you borrow money to buy a home. Everybody who's entitled to that gets it because it's in the IRS code. It's like stone, right? The Section 8 is a subsidy that's got to be appropriated every year. It's not an entitlement. It's not like food stamps, right? So it's not like Medicaid where if you're eligible for it, you get it. We need to convert housing and recognize that, you know, housing is a right means that everybody who needs a subsidy should get a subsidy, and that would go a long way to get us to where we need to be.
I
You get the list.
I agree with both of them. Well, I want to thank our panel and the AIA. And I'll invite Ben up.
All right, well, so I don't know that we solved all the problems. I actually think it's really just the beginning. But I think we gave it a pretty good shot today. There's so much to unpack in everything that you all said. A personal indulgence. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in Brooklyn Heights. It was an idyllic place to grow up. But only when I was in about middle school, when my bike got stolen, was I taught by my dad that actually the New York I wasn't living in wasn't really New York. It wasn't all of New York. And in fact, probably my bike was stolen by kids who didn't have access to bikes, who live probably nearby in a community I had never been in. And that was a wake-up call. There's something wrong with this. All of our communities in New York need to be part of the solution of this housing problem, period. So I'll rally for that, being someone who came from a charmed neighborhood. Moved next door to Borum Hills. I'm still there. So you're nearby. Anyway, okay. So I think this is the beginning, right? I really do. We're very committed to seeing this. I'm so glad that actually so many architects did show up and listen and hear. And I love your questions. I hear you're listening. You're hearing we got to do something about this. We're going to get to design. We're going to get to it. I know everyone wants to run out and now design the stuff. I think we still got some unpacking to do. But we look forward to planning a follow-up. Haven't gotten there yet. Maybe this fall. Stay tuned. I do, you know, the last one to join, come back to New York, our friend Mark here at Shack has, since he was the last one to like come back and join our little committee, he gets the prize of doing a report, which he offered. Shack has been an incredible partner in this, and it's really great, right, to actually have, so this is recorded, but there's actually going to be a concise report, and we were talking about it yesterday, and the report's going to have some prompts for action, too. So give us the summer. Give them the summer, and we're going to come back to you with something. And I think ahead of that, then we craft our next conversation. I want to thank the incredible speakers that were here today. Public elected officials, private sector, not-for-profit sector, residents, community activists. All of you came here and gave your time. That's civic engagement. We're very, very grateful to you all for your time. I hope it was worth your while. I think it was worth your while. I think the audience thinks it was worth your while. So thank you all. All of you who came. Incredible sponsors. Yeah, philanthropy can't do it all. It can't, it shouldn't, but sometimes it gets the ball rolling. So the IDC Foundation is incredible, not only, you know, underwriter, but partner, believes in this so much. I'm looking at our friend Ray over there, who's chair of the board, so involved in this. Thank you for helping to make this possible. Thank you to NYU, Shack again, and Architectural Record, who helped us get this word out the door. All right, I'll release you. We have to give back this room, but thank you so much for joining us, and we'll get this done.